This is going to be just like old times. Dr. Nick Begich is joining the program tonight to talk about, well, something he's very well versed in, and that's mind control, or probably more accurately, mind effects. He famously wrote the book, Angels Don't Play This Harp, and I just can't wait to talk to him tonight, so he'll be joining us after the bottom of the hour break. And he has a lot to say on this subject, a lot to say, and so do I. I want to talk a little bit about mind control before we bring Dr. Begich on, but before that, I have some UFO reports for you. In fact, I've got a story that somebody sent me, and it is such a curious story, I can't help but share it with all of you tonight, before we really get into the subject of mind control. And, you know, I have no way of verifying any of this story, although I did go and do some checking around, and I found that this story is out there in several places on the internet. So that at least led me to believe that it might be an authentic story. Let's get into it. It is such a curious case. I guess you could call it the curious case of Martin Rodriguez. So this is actually written by a skeptic. So keep that in mind as I give you the story tonight. But, you know, I read this just not very long after I got up today, which my 8 a.m. is around 1 p.m. So anyhow, when I got up and I read this, I had to read it again. And it really led me to thinking. So here we go. I want you guys to experience the same thing I did. I want to lead you to thinking about this. So on the night of October 1st, 1977, Martin Rodriguez, 7 years old at the time, was playing hide and seek with his friends in Spain. Well, when the time came for Martin and his friend Fernando to hide, the two boys ran into a large abandoned corral. Well, in this corral, vagrants were known to sometimes sleep there, so Martin, having the presence of mind to check first, he grabbed a rock and he threw it over the wall to see if anybody was there. And instead of hearing a stream of obscenities from some vagrant that just got hit by a rock on the head, instead the two boys heard a clang from what sounded like a metallic object. Well, the sound sparked their curiosity, being young boys, and aside from an old tilling machine, there was nothing else kept inside that corral that they knew of. Well, going ahead of Fernando, Martin walked into the corral, and he noticed a metal pear-shaped object sitting in the back of a corner. The object was about 9 feet high and about 6.5 feet wide. It had 3 circular windows, an elevator-like door in the middle, and 3 legs underneath it. Well, sounds like a UFO to me, doesn't it? This apparent object made a low humming noise, and it flashed a bunch of lights in many different colors, and after a few seconds of sitting there, the object, without explanation or warning, rose from the ground and suddenly shot a beam of light at Martin's stomach. Well, Fernando, realizing that his friend just might be in danger, he grabbed Martin and tried to pull him away. No matter how hard he pulled, Martin stood in place like a statue. And while Fernando took off, screaming for help, Martin felt extreme pain in the spot where the light was shining. He began to feel very dizzy, and as he lost his balance and he fell backward, the UFO, this metal object, folded up its legs and flew away. Again, without warning, without explanation, without any little gray men walking out of it. So Fernando and a couple of other 2 boys came back to the corral to check on Martin, and they found him weak and only semi-conscious. They ended up having to carry Martin back to his house, where Fernando explains to Martin's father that Martin had been attacked by a flying car. Now, naturally, Martin's father, Antonio, was pretty skeptical about this, and he decided to go to the corral himself and check with a friend. Well, the 2 men noticed a spot of the ground that appeared to be scorched, so they took a sample of that scorched earth, and they put that into a bag. Well, Martin was healthy before this encounter. But now he had a terrible stomach pain, and he was constantly losing his vision and getting violently sick. So the doctors that were treating him eventually transferred him to a hospital in another city in Spain, and eventually Martin was diagnosed with a condition called hydrocephalus. This is a condition in which there's an excessive amount of cerebrospinal fluid surrounding the brain. Well, things were looking pretty grim for little Martin. And over the next 2 years, he was in and out of hospitals, undergoing about 14 different surgeries. And despite the odds, Martin was slowly able to recover from the incident. He lived a normal life again, and he went back to school, where he was an even better student than he was before this incident. And for the longest time, Martin Rodriguez's story was relatively obscure until a Spanish journalist, let me see if I can pronounce this, Iker Jimenez, tracked him down and interviewed him in 1998. Since then, he has also appeared on an episode of a TV show hosted by the same man called The Fourth Millennium, translated into Fourth Millennium from Spanish. And those who believe Martin saw a UFO have attributed his sickness to the UFO. And here we get into the skeptical part from our writer here. The skeptical writer says, I would suggest the reverse, that this is purely an earthly illness. Well, you know, this is the part where I had to go outside and sit on the porch and think about this, because he showed no signs of any kind of an illness until he had this incident, right? So can we just say that all of a sudden he came down with a very rare brain disorder? And isn't it odd that he was an even better student than before? Right? And I mean, I feel like this relates to the subject that we have tonight to talk about. And I found it very interesting, very puzzling, and incredibly curious. So I just wanted to share that with you. I have no answers there. I have no explanations there. I just wanted to put that out there for you. And maybe you can tell me what happened to little Martin. But it is a strange account, and oddly enough, the UFO described in this account reminds me a lot of the Kecksburg UFO, doesn't it? I mean, the shape is a little different, the dimensions are a little bit different, but still, it is quite odd. And why would a UFO just pick a random spot to land? And I wonder if when the child walked up, he didn't trigger some sort of automatic defense mechanism in this UFO, and it could possibly be something earthly, right? I'm talking about the UFO itself. Maybe it could have been some sort of, I don't know, secretly designed craft. Who knows? I would love to know what was inside of it, that's for sure. But again, I just wanted to let you guys know about that because it is quite odd. And I have a couple of very odd UFO encounters that are recent. Actually, this one comes from May 29th of this year. And I find this also to be very curious. I'm pretty much giving you the stories tonight that made me stop and really think. And this one certainly did. A South Dakota witness at Dupree reported watching a disc-shaped object with a single light source that ended up splitting into two objects and then moved away. And this is MUFON case 84235. And I guess this was just reported June 29th is when we're finding out about it. But the incident happened May 29th at about 3:30 in the morning on Highway 212. Looks like the witness was driving home from Rapid City to Wakpala along Highway 65, 2 miles north of Highway 212. Sorry about that. And the witness said, "Well, I noticed the object on my left, and I thought it was a plane. It appeared as a white circle. But I noticed that it only had one source of light, not like a plane with many lights. For instance, first instance, it appeared to be a plane, but then it became obvious it was not a plane. Jets just don't go that way. Small planes don't fly quite that high. And the first thing we generally notice with small planes is their flashing lights. This didn't have any flashing lights." The witness also said, curiously, there's no airport in that direction for hundreds of miles, so it can't be a small plane, I thought. It's open prairie and uninhabited. Within a 100-mile radius, there's just a few hundred people living there. And it was a circle-shaped, white, bright object. It was a clear night with no cloud coverage, no visibility restriction at all, and it was moving from the northwest to the southeast. But then the object moved very close to the witness. And the witness continued to say, when it came close to the road where I was driving, closest to me, it split into two objects and changed color from white to bright orange. Both objects sped up in the same trajectory and disappeared from my field of view. Now, I was curious, so I stopped the car and I got out to look when I knew it was not a plane. I was going slow. Took me a couple of seconds to stop, and it vanished incredibly fast when it split, and all of a sudden appeared this orange glow. It vanished into the same trajectory once it split into two objects, and, I've heard of these cases before. I've heard of these kind of reports before, but it just never gets old. It never ceases to be as curious as it is. And what's really interesting is there's a single comment on this story, and the comment is by somebody named Elaine, who says, well, we used to live there in that area by Dupree in Glad Valley. There's a butte there called Thunder Butte, which has a history with stories about the Native Americans from there, the Sioux, interacting with the thunder gods. Very interesting, don't you think? Are the thunder gods coming back for a visit? Really makes a person wonder. And another one that I have for you that I really wanted to share with you tonight, just because we've been talking about lately how there are not a lot of major UFO sightings anymore. Well, this one, again, is in the middle of nowhere, but talk about a close encounter. This is MUFON case 83973, and it happened in Missouri. And I don't know what I would do if I was in this position. I want to ask all of you what you would do if you were in this kind of a situation. So a Missouri witness at a St. Francois County reported an encounter with a triangle-shaped object hovering low, very, very low over the road. And let me see here if I can get a date for you. Well, this was reported July 5th, and it looks like this happened on March 3rd of this year. Witness was traveling southbound along Highway 67 between Farmington and Cherokee Pass at about 7 p.m. So that's right about, dusk. It's starting to get dark. Or in March, I'd imagine at 7 p.m. it's probably dark. And the witness said, well, I was basically in the middle of nowhere. There were no other cars around or any houses or lights that I could see. Everything was basically pitch black. But then something odd that seemed very out of place stood out in the distance. He said, I saw 3 lights in a triangle shape hovering in the dark, somewhat low over the road, lower than what you would expect an aircraft or something of that nature to hover. It was dark, so I couldn't see any point of reference, but I imagine it was maybe the height of a tall tree line or maybe just above that. These lights were white, round-shaped lights that reminded me of parking lot lights. Well, the witness tried to see what the object looked like since it was so dark, and the witness said, I couldn't see what the lights were attached to, but they were all level, like they were attached to the underside of some flat object. The lights themselves seemed maybe a basketball size, and the total size of the shape seemed like it would have been the size of a pickup truck, maybe a little bit bigger. The witness tried to imagine the object was a helicopter, but getting closer proved that wrong. The witness said it just didn't look like that. It didn't have blinking lights like planes normally do, and it didn't appear to be moving at all, and it made no noise that I could hear. Well, getting closer, the witness could see that the lights did look like they were attached to some kind of flat object. And here we go. This is the part where I want to ask you, what would you do? The witness says, I got nervous because I was about to pass underneath it. I couldn't tell what it was, so I called a friend and I told them what I was seeing, but they had no idea what it was either. I ended up just driving underneath it and past it. I saw it in my rear view mirror for a bit too. In total, I probably saw it for a couple of minutes. It was too dark to see trees or power lines to tell what else the lights could possibly be attached to. And, you know, I don't know. I would probably park my car right there in the middle of the road and just watch it. Probably grab my camera, try to get a picture of it. I would probably want to watch it for as long as I possibly could. Or you never know what you're going to do until you're in the situation, right? So I might just stop the car on the road, look at it for a second, maybe call someone like the witness did, and turn around and go back the other way. I don't know. I'd like to think that I would probably want to look at it, get a very good close look at it, maybe drive right underneath it and see if it's going to send down a beam or something. And hope that maybe I could get an interview with somebody on board, right? Still, it's very interesting. And we are getting reports of UFOs being seen in the skies, but, you know, here's 2 reports that are just in the middle of nowhere. So those of you out there flying the UFOs, can you fly them into a more public place, please? We'd all appreciate that. All right, mind control. Let's talk a little bit about mind control. When you talk about mind control, you cannot help but also talk about the government, right? So what do we mean when we say the government? As of 2014, there are 2.7 million government employees that we know of. So they can't all be a part of some sinister plot, right, to take over the population for whatever reason. But I want to give you a very interesting quote, and I've been pondering this quote here for a couple of weeks. And you may have heard this before. There exists a shadowy government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own fundraising mechanism, and the ability to pursue its own ideas of national interest free from all checks and balances and free from the law itself. And that is from Daniel K. Inouye, who was a U.S. senator. He said that in 1977, a Democratic senator out of Hawaii. And what would make him say that? Unless he knew something, right? So, as Dr. Begich and I are talking about mind control tonight, and we say the government, this is what we're talking about. Not the 2.7 million government employees that, for the most part, want to serve their country. That's the attitude most people have when they go into government work. Or it's just security, job security, right? I myself worked for a government contractor for that very reason, job security. So when we say government, we've got to be a little careful of what we mean by that. And I guess what I mean by that tonight is this shadowy government that Daniel Inouye was referring to. And so let's get on to the point, right? Now, there are many reported stories about people who've claimed that they were tortured and harassed by remote voice-to-skull and electromagnetic mind control technologies. Most of the public, including the media, label them as conspiracy theorists or mentally ill, and their stories are largely regarded as just pure conspiracy. Well, I want to give you a few of these stories. For me, the best way to understand a given situation is to walk in the shoes of the people who've been in that situation, or get as close to that as we can, right? So, have you heard of Jimmy Shao of Sacramento? Well, Jimmy Shao was arrested for calling 911 more than 100 times in 1 month in May of 2013. And Jimmy said he would not stop calling 911 until Congress investigates the shadow government who uses satellites to control his mind and his body. And on its face, it can sound crazy. I get that. But can they all be crazy? Well, Ronald Morgan was 18 years old, a teenage high school dropout who told investigators he was acting on God's orders when he confessed to beating his father to death with a baseball bat on May 27th, 2001. Ronald said that God told him in a dream to kill his parents, and Michael Robert Lawrence, accused of murdering a vacuum cleaner salesman, said that he was on a mission to kill people and chop up their bodies after voices commanded him to do so. as a psychiatrist testified on April 3rd, 2001. And Richard Scott Baumhammers was 34 and was arrested on Friday, April 28th of the year 2000, following a shooting rampage that left 5 dead and 1 seriously injured in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. Baumhammers told a psychiatrist that he could hear people talking about him and that it interfered with his work. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm all about personal responsibility for your own actions. Okay. But if there's a possibility that some of these people could have been influenced by something else, I feel that we should explore that. So here's another one. I don't have a last name. I have a first name. His name was Solomon, and he was 15 years old, allegedly opened fire on other students at the Heritage High School on August 10th, 1999. Now, I find this account really curious because he said he heard voices telling him to do strange things, but that he reported they were robotic voices, not human. That takes me right back to a couple of X-Files episodes, I tell you. Tammy Stainfield apparently claims that she has evidence that proves she and others are victims of predictive analytics, robotics, and human logistics. She claimed that we are tortured, we are hostages and slaves to a network of technology void from identification and protection. Well, on February 28th, 2011, many mind control victims provided statements to a presidential commission for the study of bioethical issues in a meeting in Washington, D.C. And these were only just a handful of reported stories from many of the victims all over the world. And the majority of victim stories are ignored by the media as well as the public. Now, I'm sure some of these people could be found out to be authentically mentally ill. But are they all? That's the question. Could they be driven mentally ill and led to, I don't know, a snapping point? Again, people do need to be responsible for their own actions, but a person has to wonder, so what is the current data? Since 2006, many people who claim to be mind control victims started connecting through the internet, working together to write letters to government departments, social communities, human rights organizations, the media, as well as the public. And some victims have organized demonstrations in their countries and even filed lawsuits. Some victims have organized meetings to get together and discuss how to fight back. Some victims have placed advertisements in major newspapers to try to draw attention to the issue. Well, mind control, abuse, and torture is becoming a larger issue worldwide. So far, the United States, Europe, and China seem to be the most impacted areas. And 94% of these people believe that it's either government, secret human experiments, or some sort of scientist performing secret human experiments. And the symptoms that these people report, let me tell you what, I don't have the time because it's about 2.5 pages long of symptoms, including things like induced sleep deprivation, blurred vision, sensations of pain in the internal organs, as well as the rest of their body, numbness, tingling, loss of sensations, sudden headaches, irregular heartbeat, false heart attacks. It goes on and on and on and on and on. And like I said, don't even have the time to get into all of it. So I just wanted to get us warmed up there. That kind of gives you an idea of what we're dealing with tonight. And we got to take us a break. But when we come back, Dr. Nick Begich will be joining us, and perhaps he'll have some explanations for us, maybe even some answers. But I sure do look forward to this conversation with him. So let us take this break, and when we come back, Dr. Nick Begich. Well, before I introduce Dr. Nick Begich to all of you, I have gotten myself a warning in the wormhole, and I'm not quite sure what to make of this, but I guess the best thing to do is to share it with all of you in case something happens, right? Oh, and you know me, I hope it does. So here we go. This is sent by somebody by the name of Blood Wraith, who says, I have come to warn you. You are being watched by the men in black. Protect yourself. You know how, you've done it before, so good luck. Well, Isn't that cryptic, right? Especially given what we're going to talk about tonight. So Dr. Nick Begich is well known for his work and research on the HAARP and mind effects. Like I said earlier, he famously wrote the very famous book, Angels Don't Play This HAARP. He is widely reported in these areas as an expert for many publications, government organizations, as well as private companies. He has been an expert witness for the European Parliament on these subjects and provides significant research contributions in this area. Also, through the Lay Institute on Technologies, he organized a private meeting of top scientists in the area of mind effects in 2007. Dr. Begich has authored 5 books in 7 languages on technology and the impacts of change. Heard on thousands of radio and television talk shows as well as documentaries, he is a frequent commentator on new technologies, energy, politics, education, and the environment. Dr. Begich is single and has 5 adult children and 4 grandchildren. And what a treat it is to welcome Dr. Nick Begich to the program. Welcome to the show, Doctor, and thank you for joining me tonight. How have you been?
I'm doing well, and thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to be with you this evening.
Well, I think this is a very important subject, but I would like to hear it from you, Doctor. Why is it important for us to talk about mind control or mind effects?
Well, I think there's really 2 aspects of this. You know, usually when people think about this, if they think about it at all, they kind of go back to some of the MK Ultra projects that were revealed that the CIA was running, and they really think about sort of the manipulation of the human mind. But the more important aspect of this is what government and academics learned is that the mind itself and what that does, what it is, has huge latent potentials. And I think this is what's sort of missed as everybody sort of goes towards these the ideas of Manchurian kind of candidates, this kind of thing, which is certainly possible, and I'm sure we'll get into some of that tonight. But the other side of this is the human potential, what we all are capable of, what's hidden within our within us itself in terms of these paranormal or unusual experiences that most people have at one time or another, some experience in life. These are most likely natural attributes that just some people can manifest while others cannot. So we'll be talking about some of that, and I think that is probably the most important aspect of what was discovered by military and others.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to say I agree with that. As much as we talk about consciousness and the power of the mind on this show, this is just another, I guess, facet to that topic, huh?
Yeah, I really believe it is. In fact, consciousness itself is sort of how we emerge and sort of what restricts us. You know, most of it is our own belief systems, the culture where we operate within. These really form a lot of what ends up forming our reality. Our beliefs more or less push into that formation of reality. So either restrict it or constrain it, or they actually add to it. And how our emotional makeup even can have an impact on our reality and what's happening around us in a functional, physical sort of way.
Well, when it comes to technological mind effects, mind control, would you call that the dark side of consciousness studies?
Well, I would in this sense, is because the objective, there's a lot of different objectives within these programs, but primarily the idea was, in fact, it shows up in a publication called Technology Horizons, which is put together by the Air Force, and there was an article back probably around 2004, and it was on what they called controlled effects, and the idea of being able to create synthetically like all 5 senses within a framework so that you could actually experience something that was so real you couldn't distinguish it from a regular memory. And this kind of technology, when you start to think about the invasiveness of being able to manipulate a person's, first of all, emotional state, which is relatively easy to do, but then to go deeper and actually manipulate thoughts, feelings, sensations, to the point of synthetic memory. And this idea is being put forward for really 2 purposes. One is to affect your adversary, obviously. If you can affect the operator, the person at the other end of a machine, you can render those machines useless. The same is true when you think about augmenting our own troops. I mean, if you think about people with post-traumatic stress syndrome, which we're hearing a lot about now, in terms of maybe being able to wipe out memory, which is sort of the extreme end of this. Is that really something that we want to do? I mean, if you consider what the military is called to do, and oftentimes it's on the edge or way over the edge in terms of what we believe is right. Think about the extraordinary rendition, transportation for torture programs that were run by our government. When you start to allow people the technology or access to technology that can take a memory and wipe it out or replace it with something else, this is when we really need to be concerned. It goes way beyond just pushing emotions, which is relatively easy to do with technology that's been around for a lot of number of years. The other is the idea of synthetic telepathy. There were 2 contracts, for instance, led by DARPA, one of the organizations that does a lot of the research for the various branches of the military, to the University of California. And this was back around 2009, 2010 that these contracts were led. And what they were for is, one, to analyze the brain activity of an individual to the point where you could literally read their mind, an electronic telepathy application. And then the other was to try and recreate those complex signals and send them into another human being to literally transfer a memory set. And the idea was, again, for our own troops, a way of communicating that was way beyond what our adversaries would be monitoring, and then secondly, a way to disturb our adversaries by interfering with their mental processes very directly. Mm-hmm. And this is, I think, the sinister side of this technology, when you really start to contemplate the impact on free will, the impact on free thought, the idea that government believes that they should have the ability to manipulate this. That I think is a significant dark side of the consciousness studies that are happening today.
Oh, sure. Any kind of manipulation to a person's physical body, that includes the mind, that includes the brain, without their permission or knowledge.
Right.
That is just about one of the most horrible things that could be done to an individual without their prior agreement, right?
That's right. In fact, it was Secretary of Energy O'Leary during the Clinton administration that came out and said that over 500,000 Americans had been subject to various kinds of experimentation over a 40-year period without consent in the United States. Now, this included the MK Ultra programs, the mind control, mind effects programs, also things like injecting radioactive iodine in Arctic populations to see how they would fare over a lifetime, syphilis to black men in the South to see how they would fare over their lifetimes. There were a lot of programs from which there's acknowledgement of experimental victims, but there's been little to none in terms of full disclosure about who they were and whether they have ever been followed up on. A good example is the Unabomber. People remember the Unabomber. He was a guy that lived in a remote cabin, and he built bombs and sent them off to academics around the United States. They eventually caught him, but when he was at Harvard as a student, he was actually an experimental victim of the MK Ultra programs. Actually came out in New York Times articles about him after his arrest. And some of us has wondered, is that the reason? Is that the root for why he struck out against the academics so strongly? Was there something that they did to him that really altered him in a way that pushed him in this direction, if you will?
That set him off. Gosh, I hardly know where to begin here. Well, is that why whenever we have these unfortunate, horrible mass shootings, that people often go right to mind control? This person was clearly mind controlled? Because in my research on this, that was a main recurring theme that I saw coming back over and over again. Well, this person, the guy that shot up the Colorado Theater, well, he was clearly mind controlled. He even said, I'm probably mind controlled. Is it, do you think, always the case? Or do you think people just jump to that because it seems logical because of the Unabomber case?
Well, I think people in some cases jump to it only in the sense that, that it's so out of the ordinary. It's not, this doesn't happen, every single day. These are out of the ordinary kind of situations, and oftentimes are people that just didn't have a history, And in other cases, there are people with a history, so it's very difficult to discern. But the fact is, the technology does exist. In fact, going way back to the Harvard hypnotherapy labs in the 1920s, there was a gentleman, Dr. Estabrooks, who had written several books. You can find him, Estabrooks, by just going to the Library of Congress website and see what he's published. But he was involved in utilizing hypnotherapy in a way that by the 1930s he could take certain individuals, maybe 1 out of 6 people he could take down into such a profound, deep state of hypnosis, they could literally reprogram the individual to carry a false personality. And they were trying to create what he called the super spy, where after 10 months of work, you could have this person actually go into a foreign country, have completely forgotten who he was in the real sense, and be able to operate as a super spy. And this is what sort of gave rise to the whole concept of a Manchurian candidate, or a sleeper that you could send in that would then, on certain cues, would trigger some kind of a violent event. Some have even said that Oswald was one of these sleepers. And what we know is the U.S. and the Soviet Union engaged in huge amount of research in this area to create the super spy, if you will. And then as you got into the 50s and 60s, especially after World War II, where a lot of this was being heavily looked at, in fact, that's really where Estabrooks then kind of came in to his own, because they were experimenting at that time with LSD, hallucinogenics of various kinds, really starting to apply chemistry and even electronics to try and figure out if you could manipulate people for these kinds of outcomes. And again, it's kind of the sinister side of all of this, but it was very seriously and continues to be seriously pursued. In fact, in 2006, the Navy issued a new protocol for human experiments, among other things. But in that, they actually call out mind control experiments that are ongoing. Now, they require the Undersecretary of the Navy at least to approve them, but they go on today. And in fact, that protocol is even posted on our website, because we just found that just shocking that they would just call it out straight away, and yet you don't see so much in the mainstream media, but occasionally something pops up. Sort of like an ancillary little bit of news. But when you look at the whole picture, this has gone on for a very, very long time. And when you consider the state of technology today, the sophistication of this has advanced as well, even in the open literature.
And that's on earthpulse.com?
That's correct. All right. And there's a lot on mind effects there, and there's a lot of declassified materials on what they called paraphysics, which was what other people would call parapsychology, and this goes back into the 1970s. But people can see a lot of that material for free on that website.
All right. Well, good. Maybe people can sort of be looking at that while we're talking tonight to get a better idea, more in-depth idea of what we're talking about. But you probably saw this movie a while back called Paycheck. Did you see that?
I didn't see it, no.
Oh, okay. Well, I will recommend it to you, because you were talking about selective memory wiping a little bit earlier, and I saw recently an article that was talking about how this is really possible. They can go in and selectively take out memories here or there by, neutralizing neurons or something. I'm not a brain surgeon, so I don't know how they do it. But I thought it was rather chilling thing to see in real life, because this movie, right. Paycheck, that's essentially what it's about. I won't ruin the plot or the ending for you, but essentially what you have is you got a man who goes and he does special projects, and these projects for different companies are so special that they don't want to take any risk of him revealing secrets. He's an engineer, and what he does is he's paid, that's why the movie's called Paycheck, he's paid to go into particular companies, reverse engineer something for them, and when he's done, they go in and selectively wipe out the memories that he has for the time that he worked for them, a couple months or something like that. And of course, when I saw it in a movie, that's great for science fiction. But seeing a news article that this is being worked on and this can be done in our day and age, like you said, I don't know that we know what we're playing with here.
Right. And it's kind of our human experience is a compilation, obviously of experiences. We log them into memory. Under hypnosis, I mean, they can do things like you can tell them how many telephone poles, you passed on your way to work in the morning, because your mind actually captures, everything the senses pick up. Now, how you sort it out is a different matter. But when we start to think about this, and sort of the guise under which a lot of this is being developed today is to deal with returning war veterans that have these horrible memories of the carnage and the things that they saw, and maybe even the programs they were involved in that maybe they shouldn't have been. So the idea of wiping out a memory of that, it really gives the government one more leg up where they can literally use people in a way that is maybe illegal, unconstitutional, immoral, and then wipe the memory clean so they can function. But we really don't know enough about what does that do. What happens to the personality as you start to selectively wipe out memory, and then the moral factor of warfare. I mean, if you think about warfare as it's being dealt with today, and more so as we move into this century, the human element is removed further and further from the battlefield, which of course we understand that, but it also makes it much more easy to conduct war. If you're fighting a war with drones and not people on the ground, as an example, where they can even alter the visual images so you don't really even see the full effect of what you're doing. The idea of sending men and women into combat and being able to bring them back out and wipe their memories clean. The thing that kept us out of war from generation to generation was the last generation's recollection of it. The people that fought in World War I, as an example, when they came out, they certainly didn't want to see their children or their grandchildren in these kinds of conflicts. The same was true in World War II, Korea, Vietnam. When servicemen and women return, they do everything they can to avoid a war in the future, which is really the appropriate thing, and war becomes the last resort. Today, it's becoming more and more a first resort. I mean, it's almost like because it's easy, because we don't have to be there, maybe we can do these selective strikes, and you see them happening with increased frequency literally around the world, where combatants aren't engaged, but our military hardware is. Mm-hmm. And this, again, sort of the extension of it, sort of the dehumanization of warfare, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it really sounds like selective humanity wiping, because when you take out particular memories, you're taking a piece of that person's humanity away. Right. And
it just strikes me as, again, it's sort of, from my perspective at least, it's sort of in the domain of free will. What you think is sort of fundamental to what you do. And so when government believes that they can interfere with this, I think it's a fundamental violation of the human being. I mean, in most religious traditions, God doesn't even interfere with free will. I mean,
you're right.
It distinguishes us. And here's our government thinking, well, let's just sort of take care of this and give you a little of that. This is fundamentally wrong from my perspective. And as you see the commercialization of some of these technologies, because there's really not a lot of restriction, you can do very simple things and move people in directions that otherwise, with full knowledge, they might not go.
Yeah, exactly. And I could see how selective memory wiping could get ugly real quick if it was done again and again. So if you have a soldier who's very good at what he does, you send him in to do something, let's just say, unthinkable, and he does it, he's successful, he comes back, the doctors take out those memories, and what is it, 3-6 months later? Hello, Mr. Soldier, you're up again. And he does it again, and then again and again and again. And over a period of years, we have no idea how that's going to leave that individual. I don't think if there was damage done, I don't think there's any amount of money that could compensate for that.
No, and this is, again, I mean, these are human beings being asked to do a very difficult job, period. And then to layer this kind of technology on it, I just think fundamentally is wrong with it. And we don't really have any, there's no real long-term knowledge because these are new things. And in the experimental field, this is why experiments happen. But often things get cut loose prematurely, particularly in this area, because there is limited oversight. People will say, oh, we have the Congress. Well, that is really not it, and I'll explain why. Is when you look at the United States Congress, 535 members of the House and Senate, out of that 534 members, you might have a couple of engineers and a couple of MDs, but you really don't have very many with a science background. And when you think about what makes countries powerful today, it's command and control of high science. And so the political leadership, not just in our country, but around the world, does not have the background. So what happens in these kinds of projects, they go into closed committee hearings, and these are hearings where no one from their staff is allowed in. They are not allowed to make notes of anything that's said, and they're not allowed to discuss anything they hear outside of that committee room. Now, to formulate a question, any question, you have to have a background of knowledge. Otherwise, you can't even formulate a decent set of questions. So kind of the bureaucracy looks at these presentations, and they even call them their dog and pony show, where they go in and do their little performance for the Congress. That's true. And then they go out and do whatever they want to do because there's nobody there to ask them the right questions or to challenge their knowledge, and they can't go outside of the hearing room and ask any experts. So there is no oversight because it'd be like taking advanced physics classes and discussing them with a 5-year-old in your average kindergarten class. They're not going to get it. And that's the same kind of equation when you're talking about high science and technology in terms of application within the Congress in these classified hearings, particularly when you talk about this kind of science.
Wow. So they're in a bubble of kind of the blind leading the blind, and the blind don't even have anyone they can cross-reference anything with.
That's exactly it. That is exactly it.
Wow.
And there's no feedback for them.
For the first time ever in my life, Doctor, I am not happy that I understood what someone just said.
Well, I mean, I know this, from my own family experience. So my dad was a U.S. Congressman. My brother was a U.S. Senator. They did not have this kind of knowledge to even begin to ask the questions, and they didn't serve on these in these classified hearings. But when it comes to science, just look around the world. The countries that actually have high science, those are your developed, industrialized countries. They're the ones with the most sophisticated weapon systems. They may still have large segments of their population that are living in third world conditions, but that's what makes governments powerful in the 21st century, is the technology they control.
Well, speaking of the technology, when we come back, we got to take a break, Doctor, but when we come back, you mentioned some form of technological telepathy, and I'd like to talk about that when we come back. This is already a fascinating conversation. It's probably going to remain that way. Dr. Nick Begich is here tonight. We're discussing mind control. I'm Heather Wade, and we'll be right back. Well, if you're just tuning in, Dr. Nick Begich is here tonight, and we're discussing, I think, a very important subject, and that is the subject of mind control, or Dr. Nick Begich refers to it sometimes as mind effects. And welcome back, Doctor. I guess if we're going to talk about technological telepathy, we should probably start with natural telepathy. And on this program, it comes up all the time, and I'll talk to one person, and they'll tell me, this is a gift that some people have. And then I'll talk to other people and they'll say, no, this is something all people can do. It's just whether, a matter of how good at it you are. So what is your take on natural telepathy?
Actually, I think we all do it. We're just not fully conscious of it. In fact, most of our communication, I believe, happens that way, although our belief system ties it to the words we construct. And when you really think about a word, it's a symbol for a thought that gets transferred through a sound wave into somebody else. But our perception mechanisms, understand that and accept that as sort of a physical kind of communication reality. But on a deeper level, there is a subtle kind of communication that takes place. I had a couple of experiences, and recently I've started talking a little bit more personally about some of the things that I've experienced along this particular line. And with telepathy as an example, when I was fairly young, 19, 20, just out of high school, at that time I was studying mainly philosophy, religion, and parapsychology was a big interest of mine at the time. And I've read a lot all my life. I mean, I read all the time. Some people it drives them nuts, but it's just what I do. And there was a guy that I went to high school with that I ran into, and we had a brief conversation. He said, and in that I just said what I had just said here on the air, that I was studying a little bit of parapsychology. And he said, well, he goes, I can tell what people think. And I thought, okay, well, this is interesting. So we sat down and had a conversation, and he said to me, picture anything in your mind, anything at all, and I'll tell you what it is. And I'm thinking, okay,
this is great.
this is a good test. I mean, we're walking down the street. I run into somebody I know. He never had this in high school. So I picture this thing in my mind, and he comes back instantly, and he says, you're looking at a November 10th, 1958 is circled on a calendar, and that's your birthday, by the way, he says, and in the calendar there's a winter scene, and in that scene is this house and this bridge and this horse and this carriage, and he describes everything. Now, statistically, it's just impossible, okay? You just don't have this happen in this way. And I asked him, I said, did you receive this suddenly? And he goes, yeah. And I said, did you experience a trauma around the time? And he said, yeah, because a lot of what I was reading was saying that people who experience certain kinds of trauma, these latent abilities manifest as sort of a protection mechanism. Mm-hmm. Now, in his case, it was his girlfriend he had been dating all through high school, after high school even, and then all of a sudden one day she came up to him and said, it's over. No explanation, nothing. And it was like he never saw it coming, so to speak. Well, after that evening when he went to bed, he had what is described as a OBE, an out-of-body experience. And this is often associated also with traumas and also with opening up these latent capabilities. And in that experience, when he came back into his body, after that, he knew what people thought, and in a really refined way. I mean, and this was not a gift. It was a curse, actually, because he would walk into a room with his friends and be able to pick up all of the things that people think and don't say. And it was really disturbing to him. In fact, I didn't see him then for a couple of years, and the next time I ran into him, he was at work, and I was driving by, and where he was working was a preschool with preschool children, which if you think about this then being a gift, and being able to work with preschoolers whose thoughts are pretty innocent, you can move them a certain direction. That's probably very, very helpful. But for him personally, this was no gift at all. It was, in fact, a curse. And personally, I had an experience in Germany, actually Switzerland, and I travel a lot. I'm involved in a lot of different things. And after a lecture series, the hosts were driving us around, and we get a flat tire. And, men get a flat tire, they all get out, and we theorize about it for a few minutes before anybody takes action, right? Kind of a male trait, I guess. But everybody's doing that, and then everyone's talking, and at one point I insert, no, don't use a pocket knife, you'll just snap it off on the hubcap. And they all just froze. And they looked at me and they said, how did you know what we were saying? I said, because you were speaking English. And they said, no, we've been speaking German for 15 minutes. I don't know German. I've never taken a German class or tried to learn German on my own ever. And that experience was so real. I mean, I heard English. So what is that? Is that the real information being transferred mind to mind, and the words kind of being the carrier that we just assume is really carrying the information?
I've always wondered if there isn't something in the tone of the way a person speaks, if it's in another language, if we aren't picking up something from the tone.
It could be. It could be like a sub vibration, or a modulation that's on the carrier wave, which is what we are perceiving as the voice. Because intonation certainly has an impact. I mean, the way our voice expresses itself emotionally. That's why radio is so much better in terms of carrying emotion than, say, reading a book. You really have to the writer has to be exceptional to pick up emotion out of a book, right? I mean, and then in person, it's even more impacting because you also get all of the visual cues. And I believe that this underlying communication also takes place fundamentally wherever you are, hearing it either as a vibration or a submodulation of some kind, or a separate signal altogether. In fact, there's been research in this area, a lot of it that never makes it into the public view for a variety of reasons. And knowing some of the researchers that have been involved in this, who went through an awful lot of harassment after developing technologies that really would explain a great deal of telepathy as a concept. And people who work independently in this field usually don't stay independent very long. They end up working in government, and if not, they end up sidelined in the academic sideline of life, where they never get any more work or any more governmental contracts, which fuel a great deal of the high science in the country today, in fact, around the world.
Well, I would think what with the remote viewing programs and studies that our government would have plenty of knowledge in this area. And, of course, with the previous programs that you were talking about, MK Ultra and many of the other experimentation programs that have gone on, they know what the potential of the human mind is. And what scares me is if they know that, then they would know how to manipulate it. And forgive me for using maybe this is a tinfoil type of word, but weaponize it.
Well, that's exactly it. And here's the thing about it is, when they discovered this, all right, I think what they actually found is that we all have the latent capability. And what they also realized that is if only a handful of people realized their full potential and began to express it in the world, they would have absolutely no control over secrecy as such. I mean, stop and think about it for a minute. You know, in fact, in an abstract sort of way, I think about Judgment Day being the day that everybody awakens to this potential. You know, think about that as the day you identify everybody else's sins and your own. I mean, that would be Judgment Day, right? That would be the opening of the Book of Life as it's expressed in Christian religious tradition. But when you think about this, fundamentally, the transparency of the human soul, the transparency of what we are, as that manifests in the world, that is a very powerful thing. And it's very easy to shut it down. In fact, the simplest methods to shut down your higher potentials are exercised every day in the world we interact with, just in our normal interaction, because the simplest way to shut down these higher functions in the brain, and you can see it if you look at an EEG measuring brain activity, if you experience fear and anxiety, you'll see very incoherent brain patterns, brain patterns associated with flight or fight responses, the kinds of responses that you see played out in human interactions around the world every day, in business, in every culture, in warfare, everywhere you see it. Fear and anxiety are the drivers, and they shut down the higher possibilities of human consciousness, because without that kind of anxiety, experiencing the higher emotions, love, compassion, empathy, you get very coherent brain patterns that are often associated with these higher states of consciousness and awareness. So as simple things, the advertising, think about the advertising people are hit with today. It's pharmaceuticals and what's going to go wrong with you. It's deodorants. It's all these products that, you know, it's all about anxiety, and it sells. If you think about the news hour is always about anxiety and fear, and it shuts down these higher ordered ways of thinking. Reaching these higher states requires a very different kind of focus, and one that cannot be driven by fear and anxiety. That is the absolute adversary, and a very simple method, if you will, of mass mind control is just keep the population agitated, keep them in a state of fear, and then you can move the herd. And that's exactly how it's played out in the world today, either by just how human beings decide to act, or perhaps by a more sinister design.
Well, and if you look around, there's even more to it. You have to have money to live. right? And so there's a constant worry for a lot of people. Most of us, we've got bills coming up, and this is a regular monthly cycle. Sometimes it's a biweekly cycle where you've got bills to pay, you've got food to buy, you've got a car to take care of. Are you going to take care of all these responsibilities? God forbid you have children, because now, well, just times that by, I don't know, 10, because now you have all of the concerns for them.
Right.
And it just builds on itself and on itself. And so not only do you have all these problems in just running your own life, but then flip on the television and you got what you just described piling on top of all of that. And so, it's pretty effective to keep us in a state of constant worry and anxiety and what is going to happen tomorrow. Are we going to make it through the month? All of these things. I'm going to go to the grocery store because we got to fill up the fridge, but is my car going to make it? And I know from direct experience, as many people who are listening to us probably have experienced, as soon as you get into that kind of a state of mind, all logic goes out the window.
Right.
And it's not a matter of being able to overcome that. That's how the mind functions. The mind and the body perceive a threat, and they go into instant action. We've got to get rid of the threat, and then we'll think about other things.
Right.
But
it is that kind of quick response, that everyone falls into it at some point, and you have to catch yourself. I mean, literally catch yourself on the way, And as soon as you actually pay attention to the emotional state, as soon as you recognize the fear is there, as soon as you say, "Oh, I'm feeling fearful," you actually gain a large measure of control by simply observing the fact that you're experiencing fear, and then you can actually analyze why, and then you can actually take control of that fear, or any other emotion for that matter. Most people don't do that. They just ride with the emotion, let it carry them, rather than observe it and then recognize it and then either shut it off or reroute it in a more appropriate way. And I think it's, again, as you say, we have the backdrop of sort of all of our own personal things that create anxiety, and then you throw on top of it how media interacts with us to stimulate even more of it. 6 years ago, I pitched my television set in terms of cable connections and all of that. I mean, I still watch movies, but the idea of being connected to the information sources provided to most people, the window of the world, the television, you're really not watching the programming. You are the programming. What comes through that screen really dictates a lot about what our culture looks like, how people interact with each other, and more importantly, when you're sitting there in front of that screen and you come back from a day of work and you're fatigued and you're tired and you sit down and you relax and you begin to watch the screen, and everyone knows this story, right? Your spouse is hollering, "Hey, dinner's ready," and you do not hear a word. And the reason you do not hear a word is because you're not ignoring them. You're actually in a light trance. You're in this light trance, literally in front of the TV, receiving usually the news feed of the day, and it's just going straight into your consciousness in a way that affects you profoundly. And people don't recognize this. And yet when I say that, everybody goes, "Oh yeah, I've had that experience," or I've been the one hollering and had that experience. But that is very true. And when you look at television, even advertising, there's a way to literally manipulate the field of vision in such a way as to put you in that state. By just flickering the screen in a certain way, you can entrain the brain, where the brain will lock onto that external signal, begin to follow it, called a frequency following response. It's taught in every university that teaches advanced psychology coursework. And what you can do with just a flicker rate of a screen within about 20 seconds, put people in a state where they're hyper-receptive. And then you just feed the commercial or feed the news broadcast, and it's taken in a way that for most people, not everybody, but for most people, profoundly anchors in their consciousness and then begins to affect how you think and how it's colored by the fear or anxiety that you've just been fed or programmed with. And it's really as simple as that, and it happens every day, every hour.
And I would guess that it's not just the flicker rate of the screen that you're looking at, but also the music that they use, the visuals that they use.
Right.
I notice as I'm flipping through the news channels, everything's an emergency. Everything.
Right.
Every single story is breaking news. This is happening right now. Dun, 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 boom. And here's the man in the suit with the authority, and he's going to tell you what to worry about today.
Yeah.
And it just blows my mind,
And it's the script of the day, right? I mean, it's the panic party of the week. I mean, whatever it is. And you watch how literally people are moved into this kind of groupthink and begin to drift a certain direction. There was a gentleman who still is active in this field, Persinger at Laurentian University. And back in 95, he issued a paper that was really interesting. And what he said is you could create a complex signal and broadcast it into the environment that would create this underlying sense of fear and anxiety that just everybody would exposed to that signal would have. And it wouldn't be really explainable. They couldn't attach it to anything. But then you could do something as simple as the news broadcast, and in his paper he suggested you could indict a certain ethnic group as being the cause of all of your woes or a certain set of circumstances. And because that general sense of anxiety was already out there, a certain segment of the population would move that direction, would respond to that news feed in a way that was disproportionate perhaps to the reality of it, because they were experiencing this sense of anxiety that was literally fed to them. That's a very simple method of mass mind control, if you will, and one that could be done with any number of signal generators, whether it be radio or TV, or even the power grid itself can be modulated in such a way as to create these kinds of things. In fact, there's an article called Mind Has No Firewalls. It was issued back in, I think it was 98. The publication is Perimeters, and it's U.S. Army War College Quarterly. And they really got into this, where any electromagnetic carrier can carry a submodulation that can set you up for these exact kind of things we're talking about today.
Wow, it's terrifying, Doctor. I mean, if you think about all the implications and look around at the world, look at just our country right now.
Right.
My God, it's terrifying. And then you get to the commercial break, and after about 4 or 5 minutes of commercials and the show comes back on, you can't figure out now why you feel so bad about yourself. Advertising. I recommend anybody out there to go and take just an introductory course on advertising and how they manipulate you with it, because there's a lot of psychology behind how advertisements are created, and they're designed to sort of guilt you into buying whatever it is they're selling. And look at the happy people. See all the happy people? They bought the product. Don't you want to be happy just like them?
Right.
And it's just unbelievable. So with the combination of the programming, which is a kind of an interesting word.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
It really says it all.
Oh, yeah. And then the advertisements in between all of that. And you've got a recipe for a pretty unsatisfied population who's going to be out there either in this constant state of anxiety, or they're going to recognize, wait a minute, I was never like this before, and they're going to try to look for answers, right?
Right. That's exactly it. And when you think about sort of the news feed, if you will, or the information feed that people receive today, it's virtually all electronic. I mean, the print media is pretty much done. I mean, there's not a whole lot going on there. And so when you're carrying it through an electronic medium, the opportunity for abuse exists, where you could lay these kinds of layers on and it would not be noticed. You can't do it with a book. You see, you can't do it with a book or a newspaper that you read and then you critically examine on your own. But when you get a news feed that's set up like the emergency, every broadcaster is in the middle of the most important story of your life, and they create that enthusiasm. It's when I turn the television on when I travel and I look at sort of how the news works today. Mm-hmm. It is not news. This is editorializing from the very beginning to the very end.
It is. It's commentary. It is not delivering the 5 facts that we want to know. It's all commentary. It drives me nuts.
Yeah, it's not saying, well, here's this set of facts on the one side, here's this set of facts on the other, draw your own conclusion. It's, here's the facts we want you to know, and forget about the rest of them, and here's your conclusion. It's really engineered news on every level. And this idea of the neutral news, or what I call the neutered news, it doesn't exist. I mean, from the time that an assignment editor assigns a reporter to the time the story is finalized, biases show up throughout it. And I think now even more so by deliberate design. I mean, how information is packaged and sold to the public to create specific outcomes is an art form that has emerged as the primary vehicle for shaping culture, certainly in the United States and most of the Western world. Even in the poorest of poor countries, there's the window of the world in that little shack, a television set running. You know, I mean, it really is. We're plugged in. There was a public broadcasting special called, trying to think now, it slips me, but it was talking about the idea of the Internet. You know, it's called the worldwide mind. You can look it up. The worldwide mind is the concept that says that just like the Internet connects everybody today with hardware, the belief is that by the end of this century, and I think much, much sooner than that, every mind will be able to be connected. Now, think about this. That becomes the new Internet, right? I mean, this I find highly disturbing, the fact that people would artificially engage this. I think naturally we have these attributes. I think naturally we are connected on a fundamental level. But to artificially engage this in a way that, you know, I mean, actually creates a data feed into that network, boy, I think that's a dangerous place to be. And
well,
that's where the science is headed.
It's refreshing to hear you say that, actually, because it terrifies me too when I see Facebook working on technology that will allow us to think what we want to post online. That terrifies me because I start thinking on down the road. You know, I start going 3 or 4 steps ahead and going, oh no, I do not want to know what my neighbors are thinking. I could not do a show if I knew what every single listener was thinking. I don't want to know exactly what what my guest is thinking because it's a talk show. So right. It really gives me the creepies. Like I lose the ability to find the right words, as you can tell, because it creeps me out just so terribly much. Oh, and look at this. We got to take another break. We didn't get to technological telepathy. Let's do that when we come back then.
Okay, sounds good.
Because I think we primed us up pretty well to come back and talk about the technological side of all of this. And I will try to shake it off here over the break, the willies about the implications. Because, look, everything we're talking about tonight really does have some significant implications. And I think Dr. Begich is right when he talks about, you know, all of us becoming telepathic and that being the judgment day. Think about that. We'll be right back. Well, I'd like to welcome Dr. Nick Begich back to the program. So let's get into this. Technological telepathy. Is this real? Can this be done?
You know, actually, there was a colleague of mine. She's a triple PhD in biophysics, astrophysics, and geophysics, one of the brightest minds on the planet today. And her late husband were involved in some research that was, it was not sponsored research, the research they did on their own. And they developed, her husband was an electrical engineer who was able to build sort of what she conceived of in terms of the technologies and could express in the physics. And so they built an apparatus where they had, and I have the papers, an unpublished research paper because there were a lot of problems that happened afterwards. But they took 9 experimental subjects. These are people with at least no clear knowledge of telepathic ability, at least certainly not controlled at will. And what they did is they hooked up one person in one room to this device and one person in another room to this device. And then they showed them the psychic cards, you know, the ones that show the squiggly lines, the triangles and squares and so on. Mm-hmm. And 100% accurate with 9 test subjects in this experimentation. One person visualizing what they're seeing on the card, the other one seeing the same thing literally in their mind's eye. This kind of research has also been done, I believe, by the military, because this was done, not last year. This was done almost 2 decades ago. So this is old science in terms of what has been, expressed in science today. And to kind of put science in perspective, human knowledge used to double about every 5 years back in the 1980s. Today it doubles about every 6 months. That's everything from the invention of the wheel to where we are right at this moment. And so when you take that kind of expansion of technology and what I call on the mind control aspects of this, the resolution gets finer and finer. As our computing systems become more powerful, we get a higher resolution, a better way of manipulating the data. That's why the DARPA let the 2 contracts for electronic telepathy is now the ability to monitor all of those signals coming off of a brain and be able to do that externally and then recreate it and impose it on another. This is where the science gets much, much more sophisticated and where we are today. And so, yes, these technologies have existed for a long time. The other fact is these are natural attributes. And I think that's one of the big scary parts from the military perspective. Think about them imposing fear on us, but the real fear was in them because it makes every system that we have for security suspect. To being violated pretty easily by someone that has this capability. You can't hold state secrets if people can read your mind, literally. Mm-hmm. The same is true with, the work done in remote viewing. What was that about? It was about spying, for goodness sakes.
Yes.
It's about dropping in and seeing what's going on, and what they found in that is it works. And it works at varying degrees and at varying levels between individuals. What is also known is there are methods for enhancing the brain's abilities to do certain things. And the more that's being learned about that, this, again, it scares the heck out of military planners when they realize that everybody can do this if they just had the right triggers, the right events, or the right belief systems coupled to these attributes, to bring them forward, to bring them out. Most people just say, oh, I can't do that, I can't do that, and you bet. You can't do that as long as you're stuck in that belief system. But our beliefs and our emotional state has a profound impact on literally everything around us. In fact, there were a number of experiments done where they were looking at DNA while people were experiencing various emotional states. Mm-hmm. And what they found is with the negative emotions, the DNA would contract, or the coil would sort of compress, think about it like a spring being pushed down. Mm. On the other hand, the positive emotions, love, empathy, compassion, the DNA coils would expand, would stretch out. So, our emotional state having a direct impact on DNA. And then what they did is they took the DNA and moved it further and further away from the actual person experiencing those emotions. And what they found is even moving it 50 miles away, that not with a delayed response, but instantly, they were able to see the change. In other words, there was no time, space, or vector relationship. This just was like an instant, without time and space consideration, affecting DNA. And then taking that step a little bit further, the idea that our emotion coupled with our thoughts literally have the potential of creating, and do in fact, I believe, create the reality around us. How the observer sees something determines whether it's a particle or a wave, right? It's the observer is an intricate part of that process. Fundamentally, what that tells us is on a creative level, we create the reality that we experience. And here's the experience is limited by our sensors. Our vision can only see within a certain part of the spectrum, where the other living organisms can see infrared, as an example. We can't. Other organisms, or look at dolphins, can hear in a range that goes up to 250,000 cycles per second or pulses per second. Human beings hear up to about 20,000 cycles per second. So the dolphin hears a range that's 10 times greater than ours at least. So we would say, well, those sounds don't exist because we don't hear them. but they do exist.
That sounds like human arrogance to me.
Well, and it's just kind of the way, I mean, we look within our bubble, right? Within our framework.
Yes, of course.
And so our sensors can only sense certain things, and we artificially create sensors that do the same thing, and then we create sensors that pick out all of these other things. And that's what our technology really is about, is duplicating what we observe in nature. Even underwater sonars, why do we develop underwater sonars in the way they're being developed today? Because we observed whales communicating over thousands of miles, and then we decided to figure out, well, how does that work? And we learned about how there's actually a wave guide within the ocean based on salt differentials, that a very low frequency can be transferred huge distances. And so we don't do it with the feather of nature, we do it with the hammer of Thor, right? So we actually put the megaphone in the water, and destroy environments without recognizing the fact that you don't need that. You don't need the hammer. You need the same whisper nature used to accomplish the same thing. And I think that's, again, where we sort of make the observations and then we try to duplicate it. The worldwide mind, that whole concept of PBS was based on the idea that, well, telepathy does exist on some level. So how do we artificially unify that and then manipulate it? This is, to me, the alternative here is awakening the human spirit to what our potentials are and seeing them develop in a way that is self-directed and not directed by external forces, if you will, which is the case of government. And in these particular areas, think about the most fundamental way to take down an adversary. It would be to take down their political leadership by being able to manipulate them without their knowledge in such a way as they essentially do your bidding, and they think it's their own thought processes. This is where the technology of our government and other governments takes this. And that's a place I think is highly dangerous, and more importantly, is not getting the level of public debate and scrutiny that it deserves, because most people around the world would agree this is not a Cold War race we want to either win or engage in or even allow. Similar to chemical and biological weapons being forbidden in warfare, the same is true here. In fact, at one point I was testifying in the European Parliament on this very issue, and they passed a resolution. And it dealt somewhat with HAARP, but it also dealt with the non-lethal weapons aspect that we made part of that hearing. And they passed a resolution, the most important security and disarmament resolution up till that point in the history of the European Parliament. And the sections dealing with our issues passed by overwhelming margins, and one in particular about the manipulation of the human mind and human beings through artificial means. And the reason that they embraced that and put that in the resolution is we took a small electronic device that would transfer sound information, like you're hearing my voice, directly through the skin into the brain, where you perceived it as literally the words came right through, or the sound came right through. And we talked about the idea of doing this remotely. And there was an MIT award given to Woody Norris for what's called acoustic heterodyning, where they essentially send two signals from two different locations to a targeted individual in a crowd, and that person hears the proverbial voice in the head that nobody else hears. And he received patents for this. He received a $500,000 Lemelson Prize from MIT for this technology, which was later then sold to the military, supposedly as a technology that would be used for perimeter security. So if somebody crossed an invisible line, they would hear the warning, directly in their head. Well, why not just have a megaphone, right? I mean, you crossed the line, go back,
Yeah,
it just doesn't make sense. But that was the excuse. I should say the rationale that the public got to hear for probably something that's not used in that way, but used in other ways.
Maybe have a recording that would come on in a scary voice and say, you've gone too far, step back, something like that.
Right.
That it has to be voice to skull is just, do we really have to go that far? But what you're describing sounds like one of the cases I was talking about earlier tonight. And I don't know if you ever heard of this, but apparently there was a student by the name of Solomon who was only 15 years old. He opened fire on his students at his high school August 10th, 99. And when they asked him about this afterwards, he said that voices were telling him to do strange things, but they were robotic voices he was hearing, not human voices. So what do you make of that? I mean, I know without a psychological evaluation of Solomon, it's almost impossible to know, but have you ever heard of anything like that?
I hear it all the time, and what I say all the time is really the same thing, is you cannot sort it out. You cannot determine whether the person is experiencing a form of psychosis or whether, in fact, they're being hit with this kind of technology. And all of them, to a person, will say it's an external source. But this is, you know, this type of phenomena has been recorded for decades, and again, difficult to discern. And in order to make the observation, you would have to have, well, and I've checked, you would have to have about $50,000 worth of equipment rented to get a full spectrum analysis of what was coming into an area that might be affecting a person in this way. And then if they really were being affected by an external source, they would just simply turn it off until the experiment to observe it was gone. So there's really no way to sort this out, short of full disclosure and whistleblower mechanisms within government that allow people to come forward and express what's going on. Otherwise, you've got to wait for the Snowdens of the world to show up with that kind of disclosure. And I would bet that one day we'll hear from someone inside one of these programs that recognizes this as the grossest violation of human beings, and will come forward with the evidence that shocks the world and changes the direction. That is the only way that I can see it happening. It's going to require someone from the inside of these programs to come forward and recognize their moral responsibility to not participate in these programs, and their ethical responsibility to the race of human beings on this planet that cannot be dominated by external controls in this manner. And that is the way it has to happen. Individual victims, I hear from people all the time, and number one, I can't help them. I don't have the ability to look at each of these things and do something. What I do is exactly what we're doing tonight. We're having a conversation about the root of the technology. We're citing sources. If people read the books I've written, there's hundreds of source documents cited. And these aren't conversations in phone booths. These are real academic studies, government reports, mainstream media reports, and information released under FOIA, Freedom of Information Act requests, that formulate and show the evolution and development of these very technologies we're talking about. This is not science fiction. It is science fact in the 21st century, and it's the greatest area of potential abuse of any technology that I've ever studied, which is why I consider this a very important issue. The flip side of this is what's the countermeasure? You know, everybody always has asked me that. What's the countermeasure? What can we do? The countermeasure is to awaken to your own capabilities, turn off some of the feed input that you're just getting almost as a non-voluntary reflex action. You come into the house, you turn the TV on. Quit. Start thinking for yourself. Start analyzing data. In fact, not just the data you want to know about, but look at the contrarian views of that same information. Otherwise, you just create a different kind of bubble for yourself.
Right. That's what I try to do. As often as possible. Any news story, if I look at a news story and it's political, then even if it hurts, I have to go look at the other side and see what they're saying about it. So I'm equally propagandized.
Right. And here's the thing about that is most people don't do that. And so we think about how much information is available today. Never in the history of humankind have we had so much information available to us. And everyone going into this period thought, wow, this is going to be great. We have the most informed public we've ever had. No, we have the most polarized public we ever had because people regulate the feed now to what they generally resonate with, gravitate to, and feel comfortable with, not the things they oppose, whereas mainstream media used to deliver a set of facts on both sides of an issue so that you would be informed. That's why when you think of freedom of the press as a fundamental aspect of Americans' way of life, of our Constitution even, it wasn't about saying whatever you wanted. It was about keeping the public informed so the public would be the government, would engage the process, and would regulate what happened. And if you think about the way news was reported for the first 100 years in this country, every town had one or two separate opposing viewpoints, always. There might have been even as many as 7 or 8 newspapers, and they came out and they called them rags, and they were like one-pagers, right? Mm-hmm. 1 or 2 page. But they would invigorate the debate on one side or the other, and then people would meet in the places where people met and have these lively discussions about those facts. That's the way news was supposed to come about. And it did have a bias, and it was understood that it had a bias, and the purpose was to trigger discussion, not to neutralize it and neuter it. And now what you see is push news. It's designed to push you in a certain way, to create a certain belief system. And the games that are played, the whole phrase fake news produced by the mainstream media, which is the biggest producer of fake news there ever was. But they point at the other guy as 3 fingers point back at them. And this is really it. And when you look at some of the extreme sides of the news networks, and what people say are the sources of fake news. Yeah, they're extreme in their views in many cases, but those are the groups that keep unleashing the information that eventually the mainstream picks up. Now, you have to screen through it and sort through it, but you have to do that with all of the data feeds. I don't care where they're coming from. You have to be discerning. You have to analyze it. But most importantly is to try, as difficult as it is to listen to the opposition sometimes, we need to understand the logic of people's rational processes. People don't come into these discussions believing they're lying, at least in most cases. They come in with the conviction, a belief system that's based on something. What makes it possible to reach a common ground is you come in with an opposing view. The answer should be to listen, to find out what the logic is that this other person, what took them there? Why do they believe what they believe? Once you know that, you'll discover one of several things. You'll either discover the information you're missing, you'll discover the information they're missing, and the third thing you'll do is you'll fill in the blanks, or they will, and then both people's positions will shift based on full information. That's the purpose of a lively press. That's the purpose of information as such.
Mm-hmm. And that's where compromises can be made by both sides to decide then, okay, how do we proceed? Right. Because really that's the bottom line, right? How do we proceed with this, whatever the issue is? We've got to overcome this, or we've got to figure this out so that we can, think about the next problem we're going to have next week.
Right.
And if we just keep fighting over the same thing over and over and over again, nothing gets solved. And right. I see that happening more and more. And if we kind of step back from the conversation that we're having tonight, what it sounds like to me is an attack on something. I was talking about free speech last night and how important that is. But another thing that is incredibly important is free will. And what you've been describing so far tonight, it sounds like a manipulation of a person's God-given free will. And
absolutely.
Oh, wow. Well, again, I'm not happy that I understood.
Absolutely. This is what it is, because once again, the temptation, this is what it really boils down to, is temptation. Because Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote a book called Between Two Ages. He wrote it in, I think, 1973 when he was still at Columbia University. And this is before he was one of the formers of the Trilateral Commission, which people who follow these things, it's like the insider group for manipulating your politician. But he wrote in this book sort of what was going to happen in the next 50 years. And if you read the book today, you'd swear it was a history book and not a prediction, because it all came true. And within, I think it was around page 54 to 56, he gets into this whole mind control type of technology. And what he said was the temptation to use it. And the left would use it for for one set of rationales, and the right would use it for another set of rationales, but both would use it if they had the ability, thinking they're doing something good, right? In fact, it reminds me of a guy asked me a question in a lecture one time. He said, well, wouldn't it be great if we could just make everybody happy? And the answer is no. We have this range of human emotions as human beings because we need them. The fear emotion is necessary at appropriate times.
Yeah.
Anxiety is important to get you to pay attention to certain things, but it's not to be left just hanging. It's to pay attention and then resolve things. And human emotion is certainly complex. It's what makes us who we are. But allowing us to sort of ride with the emotion all the time is what we see way too much of society doing. Emotions are there to give expression to thoughts and then give power to them. This is what's very important. What I was citing earlier, those studies about emotional impact on DNA, and your impact on physical matter. Emotion is the power behind the words that carry the force of the words in such a way that it literally changes things. Negative emotions have as much power in them as positive emotions. And that's what we see manifest in our world is a manifestation of what fear brings you. A constant state of warfare, 6,000 years of warfare, 4,000 wars fought, most of it over religion as if God couldn't do it himself.
Yeah, right.
Really. Anyone who believes in a supreme being or entity has to believe also that they really don't need us to handle the killing for them. I think they can do it themselves.
Well, no. And I would think any kind of a supreme being, if we are that supreme being creation, wouldn't want us to kill off part of its creation because we think the other side is wrong.
I think that's exactly right. In fact, you can think about it as two parts of a pole. You need them both, the negative and the positive. How would you know what is good unless you've experienced what is bad on some level, and vice versa? I think that's just the way we as human beings play out our reality. For those, and I'm one of those that believe we're created in the image and likeness of a creator. Now, that's not a physical appearance. That's what we, in essence, are. I also believe that we're all connected to one another. Fundamentally, there are no islands in this creation. Everything is intricately and fundamentally, and now the physics proves it, absolutely connected. And that connection is what determines what happens in the creation that we co-create together.
Well, if we are really listening to you tonight, Doctor, that means we've got to really think about it when we talk to another person. That's having an effect on them. And this is something that I'm going to have to seriously take to heart because I get on here 5 nights a week and talk to all of you. We got to take another break, but we will be right back with Dr. Nick Begich. We'll open up the phone lines here in just a little bit, but I have a few more questions for Dr. Begich, and a few of you have sent me questions into the wormhole, so we'll get to those as well. Welcome back, Doctor. So there's this buzzword that I hear around quite often, and I have no idea what it means. You'd be a perfect person to ask. What is biofeedback?
Oh, this is great. Yeah, actually, it's really useful technology, and it fits right into the topic of tonight. Biofeedback is the idea of creating some kind of a signal that tells you sort of when your body is doing something. And biofeedback in the course of the mind, neurobiofeedback is really a powerful technology, and I'll explain kind of what it might look like and what it does look like. In some cases, it's like a helmet that fits on the head, and it has a number of sensors that literally pick up brain activity. And what happens then is it translates it through software programs so you get a visual image on a screen. And when you're doing the right thing, that visual image responds in a certain way. In other words, it gives you feedback. So you can see what the brain is doing in real time and go, okay, that's when it does this. And so where they're using it is like with attention deficit disorder children, where maybe their brain activity is running too low, and they need to boost it from, say, a low alpha, high theta range boosted up into a pure alpha range, which is a range for idealized mental processes. Or they're hyperactive, where the brain activity is too much and they need to calm down or learn how to calm down. So what happens is they'll maybe have a ball bouncing. And when the ball bounces to a certain height, it's when they hit that perfect zone for learning, as an example. And what they've done with children with these disorders is using an hour a day of therapy for a 45-day block of time. They're able to take about 80% of the kids with these disorders and literally teach them how to modulate their brain activity to reach those ideal states of learning without any chemicals at all. In other words, they get off of the pharmaceuticals, they learn how to actually control their brain activity themselves, and they become much more powerful learners than perhaps sort of, in quotes, normal people, right? And the same is true for meditation, teaching meditation techniques to hit that zone where the meditator might work 20 years to get there by sort of trial and error, and whenever he hits that zone, going, aha, that's it. And eventually the ahas become closer and closer together, and then they can do it at will. With this kind of technology, in 30 to 60 days, a person can learn how to control their brain activity to those meditative states as efficiently as somebody studying for 20 years, because you get feedback. Now, it's not creating any signals in you, it's just monitoring what's going on already in you and then giving you a bit of feedback, some kind of a visual or audio cue that says, okay, here you are. There's a simpler device that I actually have on my website. It's called the Antens, and it uses muscle tensiometers that fit on the forehead, and then you have a headset, and it creates a tone. So when you relax, these muscles in your forehead also relax. And so it's telling you when you're stressed or when you can actually calm down, and it does it with an audio tone where it starts out real high and then it drops down lower and lower and lower as you hit that zone. And then you can adjust sensitivity to become more and more sensitive so you can control it better and better. And so if you do it an hour a day for a month, and then you start visualizing the most stressful thing in your life, maybe it's your teenage kids or maybe it's your boss at work, and then you learn how to control that anxiety that you otherwise feel by being able to literally gain the feedback you need to learn how to relax. So then when you walk into those stressful situations, instead of the flight or fight response coming across, a very different kind of response comes across, one that is deliberative, that draws on the highest order of thinking that you're capable of, as opposed to your reptilian brain running away type of, or punching the guy, this kind of a reaction. You go the opposite direction. And so learning techniques you can augment by biofeedback because they're not drivers. Now, there's other technologies that literally drive you into specific desired states, and those are much, much different. Biofeedback is probably, in my opinion, one of the best ways to learn how to control your own mind for relaxation, for meditation, for accelerated learning. As an example, all three of those are enhanced by these kinds of technologies.
Wow. Well, then that answers many of the questions that I'm getting into the wormhole tonight. Vaughn is asking me if you have any suggestions for self-defense against these kind of attacks, mind control attacks. Let's see. Roger over at the Fringe on Facebook is asking, well, tell us how a person can fight against mind control. And there's a bunch of people asking that same question. So if I heard you right, the best defense against mind control is mind control.
Of your own, yes, exactly. And strong systems, they're pretty much immune, which is why when you look at the literature on this, it almost inevitably says it'll affect most people, but not all people. Mm-hmm. And people who can recognize their own processes and fall into that calm state of reason, if you will, are more equipped to deal with what life throws at us normally, and allows us to then, again, take control of our own emotional state and use that emotional state to fuel what we do with our creative minds, as opposed to just sort of falling into it and just sort of drifting along with the swill of the media and the things that really bring that anxiety about. And there isn't anyone that doesn't experience some level of anxiety in life. This is, again, a normal, natural human attribute that we have. It allows us to understand the opposite extremes as well. But ultimately, we can't let the emotions dictate. We have to decide. And that's, again, our free choice, our free will. All these things are tied together, our emotions, our thoughts. And as we cluster them together in a more self-directed way, and as we gain control of our own emotional states, this is where the power lies. This takes the fear out. It neutralizes fear. And everyone that responds, usually, what can I do? Fear drives that response. Anxiety drives that response. That's why you ask the question. And so the answer is, again, gain control of the mind as an observer of your emotions, as opposed to being the person that just sort of rides along with them, because you're in control of them.
Yeah, right. And it's an ocean of information that you are just going to be drifting in if you don't take that control. A little trick that I do, because everybody knows I'm a very emotional person. That's pretty clear by now. So oftentimes, when you get a strong emotional response, what I'll do is say, okay, why? Why do you have that response? And then it usually comes down to an action that needs to be taken. And there's another movie out there called The Game with one of my favorite actors. And he says in the movie, well, action is taken and confidence is restored. And I love that quote from Michael Douglas. And I use that quite a bit because oftentimes an emotional response, a strong emotional response that indicates some kind of helplessness, means without saying anything that you're in a situation that you're responding to and we don't know what to do about it. What to do about it. That's the key right there. So if you can stop, ask yourself, why are you having an emotional response to something? What could be done? All right, write a list. Do those things, and you just may. I mean, it won't solve every problem in life, but it's a way to take some steps to avoid being tossed on the current of information.
Right, and riding that wave. And here's the difference is as soon as you notice, see, that's the point, is you notice the emotion. You allow it to play out because it's legitimate, but at the same time, you become the observer and the controller of it at that moment. The moment you observe it, you control it. And that is the simplest secret of all. And the action ingredient to this is extremely important. You know, I was in a conversation years ago with a priest, right? And I was raised Catholic, and I was supposed to be confirmed, and I just wasn't buying it, so I didn't get confirmed. And he says to me, the priest says, "Nick, you have to have faith." And I said, "Well, explain to me what faith is." You know, and he couldn't. And I said, you know, I find this kind of difficult. You're asking me to believe in something that you can't even explain to me. And so that was sort of the end of it. But I didn't let it go at that. And what I think faith is, very simply, it's acting on what you know to be right and true and taking a step in that direction. That's the step of faith, knowing and then acting. And that action returns your power to you. And the Michael Douglas quote is great because it returns your power to you because now you are taking the actions you can. And there's some things you can't. I mean, there's some things beyond your control that require, again, an observation. All right, I can't do anything about this circumstance except understand that's the source of my anxiety. I can do something about my anxiety because that still is my choice. But again, it's making the observation that gives you the power of it, and it works very simply that way. The goal of disinformation, if you will, is to keep you in this agitated state, to keep you in this flight or fight response, so that you'll drift in the way the wave wants to take you. As soon as you resist, it just fractures everything, and it returns to you your personal power. And again, biofeedback is a return of personal power using technology to just tell you what you're doing, to give you a feedback, to broaden the sensor that you aren't. You know, in other words, to look at factors that you cannot clearly see by measuring, for instance, muscle tension. You know, you might not notice that, but the sensor certainly does, and even in a subtle level. So again, it's feedback. And then it's your own self-feedback when you observe emotions and then begin to say, okay, what's causing it? And, the last 6 or 8 months, I've been doing that a lot more than normal. Anytime I experience anxiety, I stop and I pay attention. And that's the other secret, paying attention, because most people don't. Pay attention, notice what it is, and then make a determination. Is there a list I need to make? Like you were suggesting?
Yes, exactly.
Or is it something I have to accept as sort of beyond my control, but I can recognize that's the source of the anxiety, and then I conquer the anxiety by understanding it. And I think this is really a lot of it is quite simple. And I know we've kind of drifted away from the technical side, but again, the technical side is what's attacking the very nature of our humanity, the things we're talking about now.
Mm-hmm. Right. And you can't talk about the technical side without talking about the gifts that we already have, the natural side, because the natural side of it is what we all have available to us right now free of charge.
Right.
And anybody can take advantage of that. I've been saying this frequently lately, and that is if we really knew what was the power of what was between our own ears, we would realize that's all the power that we need. And there is so much just right there, just to imagine, or know, really, not imagine, I misspoke, just to know that the human brain is the most complex thing on earth, that we don't understand everything about it. We don't understand exactly how it works. Well, maybe some people in government understand far more about how it works than we do. But if we were to grasp that and use the full potential of what we have been given just by being born, we would have so much control over where we go, over what we do, how we respond, because we can never control what happens to us, but we can always control how we deal with that and how we respond to what happens to us.
Absolutely, and again, it's it's changing the mindset, and so much of the mindset, even when I think about experimental subjects in these areas, and there's several groups that self-identify as victims. Well, I understand that, but the self-identification takes your power away too. I mean, if you see yourself as a victim, you'll always be one. And yes, I mean, there are people that are abused and horribly abused in so many ways, but eventually you have to overcome the victimization and take what control you can. And each incremental step of taking back your sovereignty as a human soul is a step in the right direction. And there's no big leap that you can make. I mean, that I've seen at this point. It's really it plays out in your own internal and external drama as a human being functioning in the world. Whatever comes at you, how you interpret that. My oldest son is and his wife were talking one day, and and I never really thought about it, I mean, I never really think about this stuff in this way, but they said, my son came to me and he said, Dad, it's amazing. He goes, the most horrible things can come at you. And I mean, just totally horrible, where everybody else would be just going, oh, this is horrible, this is terrible. And within moments or within a few days on an extreme thing, you completely turn it around and see the positive attributes of it and incorporate them and move forward. And they go, how do you do it? And I started thinking about that because it's like breathing. When you're breathing every day, you don't really have very many conversations about it unless you live in Beijing, right?
You're right.
Right? And it's the same about certain attributes that I just assumed, kind of everybody does it, and they're bad assumptions. And you start to discover that, not everybody does it. And it takes someone to point it out. How do you do this? And then I started thinking about that. And this is where it started. It started with my father's disappearance, and some people know that story. He was a congressman. He disappeared on a flight from Anchorage to Juneau. Nothing was ever officially recovered. Poof, gone. And so you have this sort of missing in action sort of sense. I was 14 at the time, and I watched how people dealt with that. And people dealt with it very differently. And I think about my grandmother that for the next 20 years never got over it, right? I mean, to lose a child is something you just don't get over very easily. And what occurred to me is, at 14, and I did this arbitrarily, I said, 70% of the people overcome and 30% just fall into that emotion and let it take them for the rest of their lives. But you can either decide to be in the 70% or the 30%. And you can decide to do it right now or you can do it later, but you're going to do it because that's how life comes at you. And so for me, at a young age, I recognize that I have to make choices. And in those choices, I get my power back. And I can make those choices through my observations and how I interpret those things. And what I've learned in the years since, in 44 years since, is you can not only control it, but you can decide how it affects you. And the most positive things in my life actually were the most difficult things that I encountered, including my father's disappearance, because it fundamentally changed me. It changed me and helped me recognize what I was and what I was not. And I completely altered my behaviors. I mean, I went from a C student to a 4.0. I went from a child to an adult by choices I made deliberately that I can still remember making very clearly. And those choices were not just thought about, but as Michael Douglas said, as you quote, acted upon, doing something about it, about what I was and what I could do. So I think that sort of ingrained in me this pattern that follows me to this day, where I realize I can make the choice today, or I can make the choice in 6 months. But sooner or later, I'm going to make the choice that the lesson has taught me, or I'm going to get to repeat the lesson a bunch of times. And we can look around our lives and the lives of those close to us, and we can say, yeah, you either get to repeat the lesson or you learn from it. And this is why I don't judge things so much as negative or positive as much as they're experiential. Because how do you know what's positive unless you've experienced a negative, and vice versa, as I said earlier. So
right.
It's part of the human experience. It's just part of our individual path of learning and choices that we make, again, which distinguishes us as human beings from other aspects of creation.
Well, we could not have asked for a more powerful example of that than what you just said. Losing a family member, an immediate family member, is about one of the most difficult things anyone could go through. And to just make a choice, well, this is how I'm going to handle it, and this is how I'm going to proceed. Of course, the initial sting is going to be there. When anything horrible happens. I've like anybody, I've gone through some also. And there's that initial sting, and then there comes time for thinking and time for what now. And that's the moment where you have the power and you have the choice. You can say, what now? I don't care. I'm just going to cry today. And you could say, what now? Something needs to be done. What is that? Let's figure that out.
And all those emotional releases are absolutely necessary. They should not be suppressed, for sure. They should be recognized. They should be they should be respected as part of your human nature, and then take it the next step. And
yes.
Even to this day, all these years later, I think, well, wouldn't it be great if he was here to see what his 6 children did? My dad disappeared at 40 years old. My mom was 34, raising 6 kids. It was a very different situation, and yet when I look at how each of my brothers and sisters indexed this and what we've done in the world since then. My dad's death and disappearance was fundamentally the most profound thing that altered our course within our lives. In fact, it was the greatest gift my father ever gave me, as difficult as that is for a lot of people to get, because it changed me in a way that if he was alive, he wasn't having that impact. I was a really rebellious kind of a teenager. I mean, I was a free-thinking person, and I did not respect authority very much. And I learned a lot in that experience, things that my dad taught me in his death and disappearance that he would never have been able to teach me in life, at least as I see it even today. And yet, these are the things that we either fall into as our horrible, this is horrible, terrible, and the government's responsible, because they probably were in my case. But I have not lived that way. I have never lived a victim's life. I've never lived under the threat of government being something horrible, even though I believe it took out my dad and a lot of other people in the course of time. Because fundamentally, I still know what I am and who I am and what I'm capable of, and what is possible is the impossible. And I see it every day. 100 years ago, every scientist in the world was saying, heavier than aircraft, flight, impossible, except for a couple of bicycle makers, right?
Yeah.
You have to see it a little differently because even the brightest of the bright can't see certain things. It takes that spark, that something that every one of us possess innately within us that triggers these hyper-creative possibilities that come out of usually adverse circumstances. Mm-hmm. Those are the best opportunities to learn and the most difficult, for sure. And a certain percentage, whatever that is, never make it past that disaster, or they continue to repeat the lesson. In either case, it's still about choices and coupling those choices with the drive of emotion that then propels you and your thinking processes into creating a reality that does work, that does have an impact, that does matter to you personally and to everyone around you that feels it. I mean, you can walk into a room, and I've seen people do it. I've done it myself, and the room can be altered by just how you are and what you radiate, literally what you radiate. And I think that's, again, the opposite is also true. And we all can recognize that when you pass that person that just, like you said earlier, creeps you out, there's something there, right? And then later you find out that's the guy that did whatever horrible thing happened that day, right?
Oh, yeah. Yes.
And this happens because we perceive on a much deeper level than what the external senses and what our mind will accept. And that's, again, it's tied a lot to our belief systems.
Well, and we should recognize that and not look at that as a bunch of woo-woo. And also, you remarked on the spark that we all have. And I can say from personal experience that, yes, that spark, that flame, it can be dampened. It can go down to just a subtle glow. But that spark, that flame, you can bring it back to a roaring bonfire. It really can happen. I have been in places that are very, very dark, and I've been in some pretty, trying times, and thought, there's just no way, there's no possible way I'm going to see daylight after this, and it may take a while, but if you do grab that thing by the horns, you actually can come back from that. We do have to take another break here, and I want to open up the phone lines when we come back. I also want to pose a lot of the questions that have been coming in through the wormhole to Dr. Begich. It sure is quite a night tonight, isn't it? It's quite a week, actually. We'll be right back. All right, well, let's do it, shall we? The phone lines are open. Dr. Nick Begich is here tonight. We have plenty to talk about, and I sure hope you have plenty of questions. I have plenty of questions over here in the wormhole for Dr. Begich, and let's start off with one of the questions in the wormhole, because I tend to forget them, and then pretty soon the show's over with. So we'll start with Terry in Cincinnati, Ohio, is asking, is hypnosis when false memories are created or subliminal messages, forms of mind control? Is that what many alien abductees say happens to their memories? Is that a form of mind control?
Hypnosis, certainly I would say hypnosis is a form of mind control. In fact, one of the really brilliant experts on this, Eldon Taylor, I don't know whether you've ever interviewed him, but I would highly recommend him. He's published 7 or 8 books on beliefs, and he is a forensic hypnotherapist, one of the very best. The idea of being able to change behaviors, again, using forms of either self-hypnosis, what they call autosuggestion, or where you use another person to sort of induce the state. Yes, it is, in fact, a method of controlling mental function. Generally speaking, people say that your belief systems have to line up, with that. So they say, well, you can't, for instance, you can't program someone through hypnosis to kill someone, but you could perhaps program them to defend their wife by killing someone. You know what I'm saying? In other words, you just have to frame it within the belief system that a person has, and then you could certainly utilize hypnosis as a form of mind control. And I had mentioned Estabrooks' work, I think, in the very first hour of the show. Estabrooks, look up his name on the Library of Congress. database, and you'll find out a list of his publications. But his fundamental area was starting out hypnosis, and eventually got into hallucinogenics and other things for controlling behaviors, but starting with hypnosis, and that continued to be a big part of his work all the way up until the end of his career.
Wow. Well, I will look into that. Terry in Cincinnati sent another message, but this is, I think, just a comment, but it goes back to what you were saying about hearing German, and to you were hearing English. She said, well, I thought I was going crazy at first, but for a while I've been able to listen to foreign languages spoken on the radio and let my mind click into a soft trance and suddenly hear the words being spoken in English. And it stops as soon as I doubt. That's my favorite part. Is the very end right there. It stops as soon as I doubt it.
Right. And I think this is tied to belief systems. And it is in that light, trance-like state that you would become highly sensitive to this. And this phenomena is reported often. In fact, in early Christian literature, they talk about an interpretation of tongues, interpretation of languages as one of the gifts of the Spirit. And I believe that is true. And I think that this is exactly what we're seeing manifest in certain instances in the world. And I think some people can fall into that state of awareness where they can literally make those translations. I've had the experience myself, and there was no doubt. I was just participating in the conversation, as I thought, that was taking place in English when, in fact, it was in German. Where that comes from, how that mechanism actually works, I couldn't explain it. I mean, I just know that I've experienced it, and others have as well. And it sounds like the person asking the question certainly has.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'm going to dive into the phones here, and I'm just going to go to whoever's been holding the longest and hope, like I said, that they're awake. This does happen, Doctor. When I'll get a call from somebody that this happened actually to Giorgio Tsoukalos, of all people.
Oh, no.
I picked up the first or the second call, and the person really was snoring. It was a pretty funny moment. So keep that in mind as we go along here.
All right. Maybe we'll get a classic in radio, and I'll get to hear a question that's really just a snore.
We'll go just to line one, and you're on the air with Dr. Nick Begich. Welcome to the show.
Yes, this is John in Milwaukee. I'd like to ask the doctor, now with you have skeptics like Michael Shermer, who's talking about, 100 things in one sentence, like 9/11, Bigfoot, and so forth. And it's like 9/11, you have 7 buildings and a Pentagon and, planes and all sorts of things. That's like a lot of stuff, right? And he does this trick of like talking about a lot of things and trying to discredit all this kind of stuff, right? And there's some people who have been looking into his background, and apparently he doesn't even have the degree he says he has. Now, do you believe the skeptics are like cognitive dissidents or disinformation?
In some cases, perhaps so. I think that's true. In fact, there's protocols for, when government contractors get some of the really, really interesting and things that are highly classified, they instruct them on disinformation, what to say if asked to lead people astray. It is the technique that is used and integrated in virtually all of it. Now, the idea of deliberately planting information out there by security agencies or others, without getting specific, I think we can all sort of recognize the propaganda machine starting in World War II, where we really took advantage of it. Yeah, I think that happens. I think some people come at things for motivations that maybe aren't apparent, and I don't really care to see that. But being a skeptic, I think, is a healthy thing. But just being skeptical about everything is just as extreme as the opposite end. And I think it's a great case of analysis and make your own decisions. I mean, I've said a lot of things here today, and I take what I say very seriously. It impacts people. People act on what I say. I take a certain level of responsibility for the actions that come from it, and I take it very seriously. But I say to everyone, don't take my word for it. Look up some of the sources in my books. Look them up yourself, and then draw your own conclusions about what they say within their full context. And I challenge people to do that. In everything I've written, I have 4 main titles out right now, and there's 1,600 references in those 4 titles. Look them up. Look any of them up that you want, and you will find that they bear out the truth. It's not my words. I act not as a scientist, but as a reporter, taking the compilation of material, putting it in an easily read form, and then attaching the footnotes at the bottom of every single page so you can see exactly where each element comes from, and then you can draw your own conclusions. And I think that's the way controversial subjects should be addressed, so that skeptics can be skeptical, but they cannot argue with the facts.
Mm-hmm. And you're talking about Controlling the Human Mind, right? Your latest?
Right. And it's the latest book covering the subjects we're talking about now. But even the original work of Angels Don't Play This Harp, it had 350 sources. Earth Rising the Revolution, which is the least sold of all my books and the one I consider one of the most important, has 650 sources. So there's a lot of material. They're very dense. There's a lot there. Some people have said, you should spread it into 3 or 4 titles. It's just not my style. Give the information, keep the commentary down, and you let the quotes and the data carry the day. And that's the way I've approached it. And yes, I have a point of view, and yes, I have an opinion, and yes, I editorialize within the context of those facts, and I make it clear when I do.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do appreciate the call, and that is exactly what I wish I could hear that from every single one of my guests. Don't take my word for it. Go look it up. Trace what I've said in the sources in my book back to the origination point and decide for yourself. I mean, that's what I wish everybody would do. And again, I'm not trying to have an agenda, but being a human, I'm going to end up with opinions, unfortunately. But I always say, I'm not trying to tell you what to think. I am trying to tell you to think.
Yes, this is a critical element. Absolutely is, and it's and these issues that we're talking about tonight, they're important issues, but they may not be the issues for every listener. There's a lot of things that people are inclined to do, and it may not be this set of issues. But when we did the research for the writing, we reviewed over 100,000 documents. We reduced it to 20,000 that we at one time held in our archives, and out of that selected 1,600 that would make the case for these technologies and the fact that they exist. The case is made. The real question then becomes, what's fair use or any use? How should it be governed? And I have a strong opinion of that. I make it real clear I do. I don't think these things should be used to undermine the integrity of the individual soul, the individual human being. To me, that is the greatest violation of all, is to pierce on this level the thinking processes, the things that allow us choice, the things that create the reality around us, our minds and consciousness itself. This is what's under attack, if you will, by government agencies that believe they know better, and that it's their job to make an orderly society of drones. And I don't believe that's the nature of human beings, nor the calling of human beings.
Agreed. Very much agreed. On line 2, you're on the air with Dr. Nick Begich. Welcome to the show.
Well, how cool is this? I got a ship captain and a doctor all in one. That's very cool.
You've been on hold for about 2.5 hours. I'm just happy you're awake.
No, I'm always awake. You know that, Heather. You know who this is.
I do know who this is.
I'm really glad to have this guest on tonight, because there's a lot of ways you can maybe help me with the puzzle box of things I'm working with right now. Heather's aware of pretty much all of them. I think all the listeners are too. I was kind of curious to know, I seem to have this weird link to DARPA's Pegasus project. And a number of the things that have come up in tonight's conversation, I keep getting all these weird messages now really fast every day. I'm losing time. I've got a lot going on right now, but a couple of things was to ask you about DARPA's Pegasus project. I really strongly believe I was linked to that. And then...
In what way? Linked to it in what way?
I think I was a member of the DARPA project.
Okay.
And this is why I really I think it's necessary at some point to have a long conversation because there's a lot I've talked about, but it won't all make sense until you put the puzzle pieces together. But to not take up more call time, this is also really important. Mandela has been showing up. The Mandela effect has been showing up like dream sequences to me daily now. I'm seeing evidence of it everywhere. So I'm sending on important things. I'm sending secondary messages. I sent Heather one the other day just so she has her own version time link to see if it changes or to have something she needs should something weird happen to me. The thing about the Mandela effect and mind control and all of that is that I don't think time is what we perceive it to truly be. And I've come to realize that we can control what's right in front of us. I was almost going to say, as of right this second, I can guarantee you I'm a first-time caller for this second and beyond. But I'm clearly not a first-time caller. That's why I didn't call on the first-time caller line. So I guess my question is, do you really feel like we can control it? Because I think that the creation of these timelines and these boxes, like CERN and my box that I created, which I believe are pretty much the same thing, only mine didn't cost as much to make, they've been created, and there have been so many timeline switches that I think we're all kind of lost and mixed in millions of timelines that are now channeling through all the time. And I guess I should just leave it at that and hear what you have to say about it all.
Well, let me comment a little bit because that was more of a lot of things wrapped into one kind of question. But what I would say about DARPA, first of all, is we had a closed conference, not open to the public, where I had brought in a number of experts from around the world to talk about this very subject. And one of them was actually Bernard Eastlund, who was the inventor of the HAARP system. And I got to know Dr. Eastlund fairly well up until his death. We had an ongoing dialogue. And when he came into that conference and talked about even coming, because I had invited people that I knew at least 10 years, that they had overcome a great deal of adversity in their professional careers and maintained an ethical standard, and they got the invitation and they came together and they knew that it was going to be on the mind effects issue. In fact, my book on mind control was sent to each of them, which several commented was the biggest compilation of all of the data in one place in an easy readable format. But what the nature of this was at the time, Ben Eastlund talked to Tony Tether, I believe was his name, and he was the director, the top guy at DARPA. And when Ben accepted the invitation was when DARPA was no longer laughing about mind control as a concept, because they were already deeply embedded in it, doing research in this area, and they were very, very interested in learning as much as they could. When I think about some of the others in that conference, we had Alex Kavarenan, now also I believe deceased. He was the former head of the biophysics lab for the USSR Academy of Science. The last 10 years there was a USSR, and he was one of the most brilliant guys out there. In fact, I just found, as I'm packing and moving, I found the discs of the various presentations from that conference, and I'm going to be posting those on my website because they are fundamentally the most important things, and they have never been released to the public since over 10 years ago. But now 3 of the people that were participants in that conference are deceased, and these were very important comments because they bring into form. Alexander Kavarenan, as an example, what triggered him to even be interested in this area of science was watching a demonstration of the paranormal in Russia when he was a teenager. And Alex is a visiting professor at a half a dozen universities in the United States before he died. But this guy took and figured out the physics behind these events, and actually delivered a presentation discussing the physics behind these various things that we call paranormal. Now, I want to say something about Mandela's also that you raised. there was a very interesting experiment that I saw at one time, and what they did is they took the head of a drum, that you would beat on, and they covered it with silica sand, really fine-grained sand that you would use in like a sandblaster, and then they mounted a speaker underneath that drum, and then using the voice, just shifting through the various tones, including the ones used in certain types of meditation, the sound waves created the form of mandalas within those sand grains. In other words, cymatics,
yeah.
Yes. And so this is really important because when I think back on when I first got interested in this whole area, it started with a conversation I had with one of my mentors, Rayo Michaela, where I was talking about sound waves being generated by different sources, and then the wave fronts interact and form geometric shapes in three-dimensional space, and those shapes can have an effect on our physiology. And this conversation took place when I was 19 in a conference in Atlanta, and that triggered a long dialogue with Rayo that continued until he passed away a few years ago. But the idea of mandalas having something within their form, I think, is true, based on what I saw demonstrated in this kind of a demonstration. So it's interesting. As far as the specific program that you mentioned of DARPA, if I've read about it, it just slips my mind. But DARPA's interest in these areas is well documented. If you just go and look at their RFPs, their requests for proposals, where they solicit the general public to come up with proposals. Now, those aren't generated in a vacuum. They don't just come up with an idea and say, let's go get a proposal going. Somebody comes to them and says, hey, we've got this great technology. This is what it'll do. And rather than issue what's called a sole source contract, they'll do a request for proposals, publish it in the event that some other aerospace company or some other technical science company that's reviewing those proposals says, oh, wait, we have something similar. We want to bid. And so then they solicit the bids, they issue the contracts. But in the solicitation, in the questions being asked, a great deal is revealed.
Mm-hmm. Well, he was referring to Project Pegasus, which I happen to know is an alleged time travel program. And he was also referring to the Mandela effect. Maybe I can distill the question to something like this.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
Yeah. How about would mind control affect a person? It is really weird that he brings this up because I was actually thinking about this earlier before the show. Would mind control be able to affect a person's perception of time, the passage of time?
Probably so, and I say this because time is I would say it's mainly an illusion that things happened instantly and we perceive a sequence of events. Mm-hmm. And how we perceive those sequence of events is dictated by a lot of things. Could you alter our perception of time? I would say yes, you probably can. But there are probably more qualified people than me that could comment on that specific program because I just don't have the knowledge.
Mm. Well, sometime, if you're bored, look into Project Pegasus. It'll be very entertaining for you. It is always very entertaining to me. And look up Andy Basiago, who talks about being a part of a time travel program. Essentially what it is young children were recruited to be, sent into different times and places. And some of the stories that Basiago tells are pretty wild. And here we've got another person who says, well, I think I might have been, as a child, a part of this program. And I have this is way beyond my pay grade, time travel.
I don't have the knowledge on this one. I know a few people that have commented to me on it, on time travel as a concept before, but the individuals commenting with me just didn't have the qualification or what I would consider the kind of documentation that's helpful. Mm-hmm. And that's, again, it's been my hallmark for 22 years, is what I say is footnoted and documented, and otherwise I generally don't say it. And in the last 6 months, I've started talking about some of my own personal experiences that are borne out in terms of the facts, in terms of the science, but I've not talked about them. And what I'm finding is perhaps more important to put in an experiential context that which I'm putting in a technical context also. And for me, it's the most important thing, because I believe that as we awaken to our own potentials, this is where the world changes. This is where things begin to happen. This is where consciousness takes its front seat instead of a back seat. And that's where we need to be as a population, as a race of human beings. We don't need to wait for organizations to form. It already did. It's called the human race. You don't have to wait for leadership to emerge. It already did. It's the person filling your shoes. Acting on what we each believe to be right and true, and then when we make mistakes, recognizing them as the learning experiences they are, not falling into the victim of those mistakes, but recognizing them for what they are. That's the way consciousness changes, and when it changes, the world changes with it. Mm-hmm. There's no alternative.
Yeah, and realizing that sometimes the person who needs to do something about something, it just happens to be you. I know it's hard to believe, but it happened to me. I'm an example of that. Well, if Art can't host the show anymore, then somebody's going to have to do that. Oh, you mean, wait a minute, that's going to be me? Oh, yeah. God.
And here's the thing about all of that, right? I mean, you took a step somewhere in life that led you to the next one, that led you to the next one, that led you to the place that you are right now. But if you'd gone back to the beginning and said, oh, I'm going to be doing this, you wouldn't have said it. You wouldn't have believed it. And because you wouldn't have believed it, it would never have happened that way. It had to happen incrementally, based on what you believe to be right and true, that you can embrace with the faith that it is true, and then act on it. And if you discover you've made an error, well, you've learned from that one too, if you learn rapidly enough and can integrate it into your thinking. But this is how it all happens. And that's why I say, a lot of people come to try with ideas to fill my dance card, and it's already full. and I say to them, I'm appointing you a committee of one. Go do it.
Good advice. Very good advice from Dr. Nick Begich. We got to take a break here, and when we come back, well, more of your calls with Dr. Begich and more of your wormhole messages, questions, comments as well. I'm Heather Wade. Oh, time certainly does fly when you're having a good conversation, right? Well, Dr. Nick Begich is here tonight. We're talking about mind control. And it's funny because in the course of the conversation, it turns out the best defense against mind control is mind control. So keep that in mind as we're going along here. Welcome back, Doctor. I've got a phone full of people that want to talk to you, but I also don't want to ignore the messages coming in through the wormhole. This one come in from Dave, and he said, ask Dr. Begich about the signal and entrainment. Entrainment is a component of resonance. MK, I guess he's referring to MK Ultra, uses this as well. Have you heard of these terms, entrainment, the signal?
Right. Yeah, and this is, again, it would be an FFR, a frequency following response. And what happens is you can, on any electromagnetic carrier, you can send a signal that will, that the brain will lock onto, that it will begin to follow. And as it follows that signal, the brain state changes to mirror it, to mimic it, to be entrained by it. So literally, it drives the brain into a specific state of consciousness, so you can generate fear or anxiety or even more positive emotions. Now, there are devices, light and sound devices, and you'll see information on this again on my website at earthpulse.com, but these are drivers, so these are different than the biofeedback we were talking about in an earlier hour. These are not just picking up a signal from you, they're doing the opposite. The flickering light effect is utilized in these devices, and also what's called binaural beat, or which is a signal that the brain will also recognize. And what happens with binaural beat, for example, we cannot hear in these very low, extremely low frequency signals in the, say, 1 to 15 hertz, in that range, or pulses per second. But this is the range where the real action is in terms of the alpha rhythms, where idealized sort of the zone for writers and the zone for everyone falls into that range, ideally for learning and so on. The theta range, a little bit below that, is the range that you're in when you're sort of half asleep and half awake, where you're consciously dreaming. This is also the predominant brain activity in children between the ages of about 3 and 6, which explains why they have difficulty sorting out reality from imagination, because it's the way their brain actually functions. And then we label them with all these different disorders instead of just saying what it really is called childhood and normal development.
Yeah. Being human is a mental disorder these days.
Right. And so here's the thing that happens is entrainment, if you utilize a binaural beat, a signal will come in, say, at 15,000 hertz in one ear, which is within the range of human hearing, and come in the other ear at, say, 15,008 hertz. They'll self-cancel and leave you the difference, which the difference between 15,000, 15,008 is 8. 8 happens to be the very low end of the alpha frequency. Your brain will lock onto that and entrain to it. In fact, Bob Monroe from the Hemisync Institute, now deceased, also developed a whole series of programs that capitalize on binaural beat. And you need a headset to get that full effect, to get these frequency signals that the brain will entrain on and lock onto. The other is the flickering light effect. And if you have any history of epilepsy, you cannot use these devices for obvious reasons. You know, the flickering light will trigger in many people epileptic seizures if they have that predisposition. But what they'll also do, you can flicker the light at, say, 8 hertz. It'll go through the optic nerve. The brain will then lock onto that signal and begin to mirror it. So you can literally change your brain state by external means that are under your own control. You can also use these devices. Some of them come with where you can jack in an audio cassette, so you can make a voice of your own subliminals, if you will, and your own information that you want to integrate into your thinking processes, and then using the flickering light and the binaural beat effect fall into that super suggestive state, and you trust your own voice more than anyone else. So your own subliminals coming in your own voice to enhance certain behaviors or dampen behaviors is very powerful when the brain is in the right state of awareness. So these devices are useful, and that's essentially the explanation of frequency following response as it relates to brain entrainment.
Wow, it's so fascinating. There are so many ways for a person to get control of their own mind, whether they feel they're a targeted individual or not. There are plenty of resources and methods out there because not every method is going to work for every person, I would imagine. So, a person could try different things until they land on something that works. But I just got the pleasure of having a conversation with Nancy McMonagle, and she works very closely with the Monroe Institute, and the things she had to say about Hemisync and how it's used, and questions that a person can ask while they're in that state and get great insight into problems that we have. It was just fascinating. So I'm on board, absolutely on board for all of that. Let me see, where are we going to go to? It looks like on the first-time caller line, you've been on hold there for quite a while. You're on the air with Dr. Nick Begich. Welcome to the show.
Hello. I'm really enjoying your show, or you being on. And Heather, you're doing such a beautiful job. I really love what you're doing.
Oh, thank you.
I wanted to ask Nick, did I hear you say that something about maybe we become transparent as sunlight? To have nothing to hide. Did I hear you say something to that effect?
Yeah, I think that ultimately, at least when I think about human consciousness and awareness, and I mentioned it earlier that, I believe Judgment Day is the day that we all have this perception of recognizing a telepathic capacity. That's, in my view, the opening of the book of life, where everything is revealed. And what it requires is, first of all, a lot of self-forgiveness, and then secondly, a lot of, not tolerance. I don't like that word because it's like a word that you reluctantly go to the dance, right? I think it's really about acceptance more than tolerance, and acceptance of the fact that we are human beings with successes and failures, and from those successes we emerge, and also from those failures we grow. That's, I think, the essence of it. And as time goes on, I think the technology alone makes us more and more transparent. If you're engaged in social media of the various forms, you are becoming increasingly a transparent person because so much of your life is revealed. In fact, just your searches on the Internet. If you do searches on the Internet and that you create 300 data points that's enough to get a profile of you that's equal to somebody that's lived with you for 5 years. If you can get 3,000 data points, you can get the same profile of you in terms of what you'll do and predict your moves that somebody who lived with you for 20 years. In fact, they can predict with that many data points more about you than you can predict about yourself with a higher degree of accuracy. And that's just using things like internet searches and just kind of the public domain kind of records. If you think about personal privacy as a concept, it's no longer what goes on in your house as it was when the Constitution was passed. It's the digital doorway that contains the essence of who you are in so many ways. And as the resolution increases, and I use that word a lot because as the resolution increases, the transparency increases, and the need for recognition, forgiveness, and growth also increases. But when that is manipulated by government or by individuals, very powerful outcomes happen. In fact, the guy that really developed the computer models for this, he developed them in Poland. He later went to Cambridge. I forget the name of the science, but they gave it a specific name, and it was used in 2 very recent elections. It was used for Donald Trump's election, and it was used for Brexit. And it was used defying everything the other statistical models showed for outcomes, because they all predicted very different outcomes. But they were able to drill down and define personalities to the point where they could tailor messages specifically for you, utilizing your various data points. So transparency already exists to a certain level, and a level that can be highly manipulated. For instance, in the Trump campaign, one of the things they did is people couldn't figure out, every time bad news came out, his poll numbers went up. And they couldn't figure out how that was happening. Mm-hmm. And what was happening behind the scene is they had profiled the voters to such a high degree that, for instance, in the South where they were having where Hillary had an edge among black voters, what they did is to those voters they could identify, and that was a lot of them, they sent in the messages which showed, and I think some people recall this, where Hillary's voice is voiced over a policeman with a dog attacking a black person. And Hillary is saying, we have to bring them to heel, because those were the words she used in a public presentation talking about crime and inner city difficulties. But that image tied with her voice going to the voters that were generally going to be favorable to her, what they did is neutralize the voters. They just went, I'm not even going to vote, because they weren't going to support the other guy. But this is how data is manipulated on a grand scale with very, very clear outcomes, and you're going to see more of this. I predicted this in Earthrising the Revolution in 2000, that this would be the way elections are run. This is the way they're going to be run from now on. It's not going to be the 100 issues that you're concerned about. It's going to be the one issue that they know resonates with you, that connects with you, that they're going to be able to feed you that and ignore all the other issues. And this is, again, transparency is coming because people voluntarily give their information up on Facebook, LinkedIn, and all of these other social medias. I went on Facebook for 4 days, and I thought, I'm not doing this. I got through the process of signing up for LinkedIn, and I went, I'm not doing this. So I get these inquiries all the time. Hey, join this. This guy wants... If people really pay attention, they'll find out there are no links on LinkedIn for me. 0. I didn't put any in. There are no Facebook links for me because I didn't put any in. I was disgusted by what I saw and what I know about how that information is used. Mm-hmm. And so I don't participate in social media. And some people say it's to my detriment, that I could be doing much better economically. I don't care about that. What I care about is my personal privacy and my personal liberty, and I don't like being manipulated. And that's what I see these systems doing.
Well, look, if a man who has written an extensive book about mind control looks at Facebook and goes, oh, no, I'm not participating in this. This is kind of gross to my sensibilities. We all need to listen to that. I want to do a show on data mining firms because it sounds like that's what you're talking about.
Yes.
It's an absolute reality right now, and there are very sophisticated algorithms that run the data mining itself that are all very close. I mean, they are right as close as we can get in our day and age to artificial intelligence. And these data mining firms, the more data we put out, and that includes taking a picture of your lunch. That includes when you go out to the local restaurant, tell everybody on Facebook that you're at the local restaurant, you're going to get some back ribs or whatever, that you're out shopping, that you're looking for a house. All of these personal things are all collected.
Yes,
and
everything.
Used. Yeah, this is not a conspiracy theory, right, Doctor?
It is not. In fact, again, 17 years ago, I footnoted this in Earthrise and the Revolution. Every source that showed this trend, this is where we're going to go, this is where we are. And this is the transparency I'm talking about. This is an artificial kind of transparency. There's another kind that we've been talking about too, and that's that whole concept of telepathy or these extrasensory perceptions, or what the military now calls anomalous human capabilities.
Oh, I like that.
Because ESP has a bad connotation, because people attach all kinds of things to it.
Yeah.
And so they give it a new name, shine it up a little bit, and call it something else. And this is the government's famous for this. It's like fake news. Oh well, we can't talk about the real news, so let's just give it a new polish, and then we can send that message out. Messaging is really what we're talking about here. Is what is the message? Who is the messenger, and how do we adjust perceptions? And there is a lot going on in this space. And in fact, I think this is commercially data is manipulated. And this is what I said years ago. And I said that everyone wasn't worried about it because they couldn't sort it all. Well, we're getting there. And I'll tell you when we make the huge leap is when quantum computing falls into the mainstream, because a supercomputer today doing 280 teraflops a second, which is equivalent to everyone on the planet, 7 billion or 8 billion people doing a hand calculation on a calculator every 60 seconds for a couple of days to do what a supercomputer today does in a second. Phenomenal, right? Phenomenal. Mm-hmm. What a quantum computer will do in an hour, the supercomputer will do in 1 trillion years. Let me say that again. The quantum computers that are coming will do what a supercomputer does in 1 trillion years, which is all those people running all those calculations. Now, what does that do in terms of profiling? This will seem supernatural, the ability to predict the future, but they'll always be a little bit off, so over time, the predictions will become maybe less accurate. But the point of the matter is, people will become more and more dependent and more reliant on these systems, becoming a greater part of, if you want to call it a matrix of cultural function, as opposed to the independent function of what I believe our founding fathers were all about. It was about the individual, not the squishy collective. It was about reaching your highest and best potential as a human soul, and then expressing that in our experience and assisting by our living experience others to achieve the same. That is the empowerment of a democratic republic. That is the empowerment that our founding fathers embraced, that we have lost in the squishy collective that has been created of dependence on these external systems. And our transparency isn't for our evolvement. Our transparency is for our manipulation and control. And that is so opposite, so upside down from where things started and where they should have gone.
Well, that makes us all targeted individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just a matter of degree, or maybe a matter of recognition, But I think we all are, on a certain level, either commercially or politically, targeted for outcomes. Mm-hmm. People don't, in politics, it's all about outcomes. That's what polling and spin is all about, which is now the hallmark of modern politics. It's not about quality and content and character. It's about what do people want to hear and how do we spin the message. That is absolutely upside down. That is not what societies need. What we need is truth, transparency, reality. I mean, I look at the recent elections in the United States. What was it really about? It was about authenticity. You looked at all those candidates on the Republican side, and there were the robots, and there were the parrots, and there were the script readers. And then there was the one guy who had all the blemishes and all of the scars, but he was authentic. At least he was perceived as authentic. I think about the Democratic side. If Hillary hadn't had the front-loaded delegates, it would have been Bernie Sanders. And why was Bernie Sanders so attracted to so many? Because he appeared authentic also. What he said he actually believed. He wasn't reading a script. It comes out of the essence of him. Now, whether you agree or disagree with either of these characters, the authenticity is what rang with the public, because that is what the public needs right now, is authentic leaders of a higher quality and a higher character than the ones we saw in the last election cycles.
Well, there's just so much around us that's fake. People are screaming for anything that's real, whether that's something they get to eat, whether it's a person that they talk to, whether it's where they get their information from. People are looking out there, and they're hungry for something, anything that's real in this world, because more and more and more things just come across to us, as fake, and people pick up on that. People pick up on that right away. In fact, one of the things when I asked Art, okay, so I'm going to host the show now, exactly how in the world do I do this? You want to know what his big secret sauce is? Be yourself.
Yeah.
And
everyone else is taken.
Be yourself and be honest and have fun. And those two things being first, be yourself and be honest, are first and second for a reason, because he said, look, people just are hungry for something real, and you have to be real. And that's it. If anybody wants to go out there and get in radio, there's the big secret. I
absolutely believe it. And, I did this segment, and it was titled by the guy I did it with. It's called Breaking the Zombie Trance, and it's on technology and a different way to perceive things. And I did it with InfoWars, with Alex Jones, who I've known since he started over 20 years ago. And a lot of people got really offended that I would appear with Alex. And Alex is an excitable guy. He covers a lot of issues that other people don't. And you know what? I'm not making the judgment. What I am doing is delivering my message within the context of the opportunities to present. And over dinner on the last night I was with him, we ended up in a conversation about some of the things we're talking about tonight. And he wanted to film right there in the restaurant. Instead, we did it the next day, and it was supposed to be a 10-minute segment turned into 45. But it was so contrarian to what I would have expected to do, and yet it had the highest positive responses of the 5 segments I produced with his team down there. And what it was again talking about my own personal experiences as I apply them to the work that I do, as a way of seeing. And I've said it, my slogan since I began was changing the way we see the world, because that is the only way the world truly changes. And so there's methods, there's ways of doing that. And I mean, I posted the link on my website again, because I think it's an important one that really gets to the meat of what motivates people like me and allows us to walk through some very dark areas of research, but not experiencing fear in the process. I have never experienced fear in the work that I do. Now, I have for a lot of other reasons, but not for this work, because I do it with confidence and with knowledge. And that dissipates the fear, and that's the big message of this evening: is let go of the fear, find a way through it, recognize this is the fiery furnace of life. It's what refines us into the gold that we become. These are not negative experiences; they are part of the burn process to refine who we are as human souls.
Very, very well said. And I hope Alex heard what you were saying.
Well, he's a very interesting guy, and he's a very complex guy. And what he does because he truly believes in this country and in the idea of free thought and free expression. And you're going to see him continually taken out of context and villainized, because he is having an impact. And, I mean, I look at his Alexa ratings in terms of his web traffic and connections and so on. He's close to NBC. And he has actually almost twice as many links as NBC, which tells you he's having an impact on people's thinking and processes. And I will always do programs with people that invite me to do these, because it's an opportunity to have that healthy dialogue that gets us to a finish line at some point. We don't have to agree with everything everyone says, but in fact, if we do, somebody's lying because I've never met two people that agree on everything.
You're right. Talk about authenticity, right? On line 3, you're on the air with Dr. Nick Begich, although we're coming up on a break, so I may have to hold you over the break, but you're on the air.
Well, thank you. You're doing a great job tonight, and please hold me on the break. Before top guest here. I only wish I was there interviewing with you. Nick, first off, I want to say that your picture looks a little bit like Michael Caine in this on the website here. So you were discussing him earlier, Heather. But before I get into my questions, you have consulted with the military, you've consulted with private industry. Have you been a member of the military or under any kind of government contract?
Well, we're going to have to hold the answer. Never. Well, no. Okay. Well, we got the answer to that. But I am quickly running out of. Well, no, hang on. I got to take a break, or the break's just going to cut us off. So please stand by for me if you would. And when we get back, well, you both will still be there, and we can talk then. We are quickly running out of time tonight. We'll be right back. Well, the phone lines are open, and Dr. Nick Begich is here tonight. We're discussing mind control, and we're in the middle of taking your calls right now. So we're in the middle of a call right now. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Nick Begich back to the program. Welcome back, Doctor. Let's bring our caller back. You're back on the air, and I really want to apologize to you because, boy, the break just sneaks right up on you. And if I don't take it, well, I'm not doing my job. But we're back. You're on the air. We've got plenty of time. Go right ahead.
No, thank you. No problem. I know I'm a professional. I know how you work, Heather.
I want to finish that comment on government contracting. I have done contracting for native tribal governments here in Alaska, which is quite different from what I think you were referring to. I want to make that real clear. I've done some contracts for the Anchorage School District in my past, but never military contracts, never any security agency contracts, nothing like that.
Thank you for your honesty. Now, I have 2 or 3 things that if you know nothing about them, pass them by, but I'll ask them all at once. We're kind of the same generation. Mind control, smart meters, HAARP, and these more than one Norwegian spirals that are not CGI. They have been appearing. Do you know about any of these? Is HAARP related to the Norwegian spirals? Can these smart meters that are now being thrust upon our homes and businesses, I know they have radio waves, could they be used to do mind control? And while we don't get political on this program, and I don't want to go there.
Yeah, we do. We can get whatever we want on this program. I'm in charge. Okay. We can talk about anything we want.
Well, I don't want to get one side or the other, but you're kind of, Nick, like on the right side of a Joseph Campbell. We're not talking just spiritual, but we're talking real things that affect our country and the first world and eventually the third world. So I guess that's what I wonder. Those things that I mentioned, smart meters, mind control, HAARP, could any of them be related? And the fact that the Internet now really, the president has just appointed a guy who said he wants to do away with Internet equality, neutrality, which many of us, including myself, fought and wrote petitions to stop the FCC a year or two ago from doing that. And they said, fine, now this is all going to be flipped over. And if we have a slower Internet, then the information gets meted out at different rates for different people based on ability to pay. But that's the political. I was more interested in the spirals, HAARP, and the smart meters, and whether we're just being paranoid, or from your research and experience, could these be dangerous to our freedoms and liberty?
Okay, firstly, on HAARP, most people know me from that work. I wrote with Gene Manning the book Angels Don't Play This HAARP, which is the classic on the subject. So, yeah, I do understand what it's about. There are many ways to utilize HAARP. I had mentioned in an earlier hour the thought that Persinger had in 1995 at Laurentian University, where you could create a complex signal that would affect people over a large geographic area and give them an emotional feed, make them anxious, make them fearful, this kind of thing. You can go back to the work of G.F. Gordon MacDonald, who said if you could ever figure out how to electronically stroke the ionosphere in just the right way, you could return a signal to the Earth that would manipulate people within the field of that signal. That was also mentioned in Zbigniew Brzezinski's book. I think it's page 54 to 56. You'll see that same reference. HAARP can create a complex signal, just like Persinger predicted. That could be utilized to entrain brains, which I explained in the earlier segment, in such a way as to create those emotional sort of responses. But what I will say about that is, according to Orienteer, a Russian military journal, and Perimeters, the U.S. Army War College journal, any electromagnetic carrier can carry a signal to manipulate the behaviors of people. This includes smart meters, the internet, telephones, the power grid, radio, TV, and so on. Any of these things, cell towers, as an example, could carry submodulations that could be regionally located in very tight proximities. And the new cell phones towers, the ones that have antennas that can narrow the beam to a relatively few meters, again, could target specific groups or individuals in a way to manipulate behavior. These technologies are all interlinked. They are all interconnected, and it depends on the sophistication of the operator, the computing power, which is increasing, every year. And so I say, again, using this phrase, resolution, our ability to see this, to manipulate this, becomes finer and finer and more possible. So there was the mind control, I think you asked, the HAARP, the smart meters. There was another component to this question. I
Norwegian spirals?
Oh, yes, the spirals. If you look at the location of the Max Planck Institute out of Germany actually runs in Tromsø, Norway, an ionospheric heater. These are, in the U.S., we call the ionospheric heater. In Alaska, we call that one HAARP. But these are situated around the world. Tromsø is one of the locations. The idea of creating that spiraling visual effect, that would be cyclotron resonance, which is what, in fact, these transmitters produce. If you throw barium into the upper atmosphere, and then you utilize this transmission signal, you'll get a visual image. So here in Alaska, they use the Poker Flats rocket range to launch payloads of barium into the upper reaches of the ionosphere, and then they send the signal in so they can visually see what that signal is doing, and that's where you get those spiraling effects. The scientists involved at HAARP are the same scientists that are involved virtually around the world. It's a very small cluster of researchers that deal with these types of instruments and their experimentation. So the research base is shared among the participants, but that would be what I believe the spirals are in Norway is exactly what I just described.
Interesting. Very interesting. I had not heard about that. Thank you very much for the call. And just to comment there, it's just a lot of other people who have said, don't talk about politics, don't talk about current events, but I'm going to anyway. And that's just the way it is. So get ready for it. I don't know, brace for impact. When current events happen, turn it off. I don't know what to say. But look, these are direct. If it makes anybody feel any better, that's not coming directly from me. If it gives me just a little more credibility, that's what Art told me to do. And that's what I'll do. He's my instruction book here. So that's that. All right. Let me see. On line 2, you're on the air with Dr. Nick Begich. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
Hello. Hi. You're on the air.
Hey, great. Well, Captain, I know you're busy in the left seat there, but there's a nasty little snaggletooth gremlin chewing on the right wing. Mr. Baggage, or Dr. Baggage, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much for the call.
Yeah, well, I tell you what, you gave me a lot of fun back in '98. I got to speak to the director of HAARP at the Air Force Joint Navy Air Force High Energy Lab. Asked him a lot of very nasty questions. He didn't appreciate it.
Actually, the best interview that was done with John Heckscher, who was her public relations guy, and it was done by Wendy Mesley of the program Undercurrents, which is the highest rated public television program on CBC Canada. And we had a technical memorandum that he had denied even existed. In fact, it wasn't supposed to be published, it wasn't supposed to be available, and it wasn't available under the Freedom of Information Act request because of the way they did it. But I got a copy of it and gave it to the media, and they were able to confront him on the air. And when they did, he rolled up like a pretzel in terms of, talking about a guy who closed himself off for any further comment. And he denied knowing anything about it. And the fact of the matter was he distributed the 80 copies of it that went to the participants of the conference that he organized to set the contract perimeters for HAARP. And the military at HAARP traded hands on this a few times. It was originally an Air Force Navy joint venture with the cooperation of the Geophysical Institute, which is part of the University of Alaska Fairbanks. It then transferred over to DARPA, which exclusively had control of it, and then they released it back to the university and gave it to the university under the theory that, well, they're not using it anymore. But in fact, it is government agencies that are the primary contracts that the university now gets. Just the who physically controls the site has changed, but the work that's being done there has not changed at all.
Yes, sir, I'm quite aware of it. The only interesting thing you'll find is I had to give him my name, my address, my social security number, my DOB, and then I asked him when he was going to quit playing with the diesels and switch over to the electromagnetodynamic power, but he said he couldn't comment on it. Nevertheless, what I want to talk to you about, are you aware of the MC Ultra type? I'm in Kentucky and I'm off the fringe, but I'm a ham operator, and so and I've dealt with electromagnetics since I was 14, kind of a pet hobby of mine. But nevertheless, University of Kentucky, University of Louisville, about 4 or 5 years ago, had a Northern European. I couldn't quite define the accent, Bavarian, maybe Austrian scientists here, and they were doing studies on using very low-level shower cap type electromagnetic stimulation of the brain to tranquilize people that had severe autism, Asperger's, things like that. And then I found out it was being paralleled at U of K. And the most interesting thing about this is they actually showed a PET scanner of somebody, and their brain was lit up like a Christmas tree. And then they switched on the electromag and fine-tuned the impulses, and the lights went out. And this guy said something that was absolutely terrifying. And someone asked him, what's the power level? And he said, well, we started out thinking in milliwatts. And he said, then we found out we better get way down to microwatts.
This is an important issue that you're raising, because it's not the amount of power, it's the frequency and how the signal is constructed that is relevant. Think about it like tuning a radio. When you're in between the stations, you get static, but when you get resonance between the transmitter and the receiver, the sound comes through clearly. And what has been learned about the human mind and body is it's not the amount of power, it's the signal, the shape, the pulse rate, the attributes of the signal that allow the coupling, and it doesn't require huge, prodigious amounts of energy. It just requires the right signal.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, we don't have very much time, and I do have some other callers that I want to get on the air here, but I think this is Paul. This is Paul in Kentucky, right? Did you have a specific question that you wanted to ask?
No, just to thank him for letting me be able to corner Heckscher like that, and simply to thank the doctor for all of his tremendous research in the area, because as far as I'm considered, in my world, he's the top gun in this area.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that.
Yes, I do appreciate the call, and clarifying the point of frequency, I think, is really important, because we tend to think that, to make a bigger impact on something, anything, a mind, whatever, that you need more power in order to do that, but that's not the case. Wow. Let me see here. We'll go to line 4. You're on the air with Dr. Nick Begich. Welcome to the show.
Good evening, Heather. Good evening, Dr. Begich. This is Mike in Montana. Dr. Begich, I have a question that I don't think I'll ever get a chance to ask again, but you being who you are, your opinion is really the only one I care about. Do you believe that your dad or House Majority Leader Boggs was the target of a government assassination?
I'll say this about that. I do talk about this in a book I wrote, Earthrising 2. And in 1993, there was a FOIA request by a publication called Roll Call in Washington, pretty prestigious publication. They were looking into the death and disappearance of congressmen and senators, starting with my father and Hale Boggs, who was in fact the majority leader at the time, and Hale was someone who was really outspoken, a very strong, independent-minded individual. He had called 6 months before for the resignation of J. Edgar Hoover. He was sick and tired of J. Edgar Hoover tapping his phones and all of his colleagues and blackmailing them, and he wanted him out. And he was taking on the Nixon administration in a pretty vigorous way. In fact, just before their plane left October 16th from Anchorage, it was right before the second election of Richard Nixon. People know a fraction because of the pardons and what happened afterwards. And just to review that, if you recall, Agnew was out of office. He was then convicted, and then you saw Ford step into his position, then Nixon resigned, Ford pardoned him, and then he moved into the presidency, and Rockefeller moved in behind him, and then Squeaky Fromm, one of the old Manson women, tried to assassinate Ford, which would have put Rockefeller in charge. This was the way it was supposed to play out from one side of the equation. The other side of the equation would have had it go a lot differently. McGovern had not a shot to win the presidency. Everybody knew Nixon was going to win it. They figured they could bring Nixon and Agnew out at the same time, which would have been the Speaker of the House, who at the time was Carl Albert. He was a very good friend of my dad's. He was hanging around the House a lot at different events, but I believe Albert would have stepped down. Boggs was the majority leader. He would have stepped up, and it would have been Boggs and the Democrats who would have been running the executive. That didn't happen. Boggs disappeared with my dad, and it was 20 years later that telexes were reviewed from the FBI coming from surveillance technologists in California and Long Beach that actually had located the plane. There were 2 people alive at the crash site, and they never recovered anything officially. And this was verified 3 days later by the FBI. It came out in the roll call FOIAs. So yes, I believe if they didn't institute the plane being lost, they certainly didn't go back to pick up the survivors. This is why my mother got out of politics, left Alaska. For the rest of my brothers and sisters, this is one of those underlying things that keep us in this. Because if this can happen to United States congressmen, this can happen to a majority leader, it can happen to anybody. And this is not the government of the people, by the people, and for the people anymore. It's a government that is totally twisted, that is totally... You want to talk about fake news, you can talk about fake money, fake government, fake food. You know, what we have is an upside-down equation, and the population, us, need to awaken to what we are as human beings, take control of ourselves first, and then begin to take our government back. And I'm not talking about violently, I'm talking about just the opposite. Powerful, informed people that turn off the television set and turn on their brains will take this country back.
Mike?
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the call. Yeah, well, That's why he's a guest on the program.
Well, thanks for the call, Mike. I appreciate it. And again, as I said earlier, my father's death and disappearance was the single most important thing in my life, not from the negative aspect, which I also experienced, but because it transformed me. And I would say every negative experience that every listener is hearing right now and thinking about, how can it transform you? Let it transform you. Recognize what it is emotionally, and then let the transformation take place, because that's where we grow.
Oh,
that's
yes.
where we'll change.
Absolutely. Oftentimes, a challenging situation for us is a catalyst into another chapter. And it can feel horrible, and it can feel so painful, and it can feel like that pain is never going to end. And
birth pains. Those are birth pains.
Yes, right, yes.
And they bring about life in a metaphoric way. Those are the birth pains of our personal growth.
Yeah, right. I mean, I know, and I remember being in my moments of darkness and pain, and people telling me, well, that means you're supposed to learn something from this, and I would just get so mad, well, why does this have to I can learn things without this having to happen. Now, come on. But it'll take a little time. If you're in that stage, just let the time take care of that. Time is the only thing that can take care of that, and then you'll get to the list making. It's just a process that sort of needs to play out on its own. But I gave this quote at the beginning of the show, Doctor, and I want to give this quote to you and get your take on this, because you were just talking about our government. And you may be familiar with this quote already. There exists a shadowy government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own fundraising mechanism, and the ability to pursue its own ideas of national interest, free from all checks and balances and free from the law itself. And that comes from Daniel Inouye. He said that in 1977. He was a Hawaiian senator.
Yep. He was a good friend of my father's, and he is absolutely correct. And he was also a very good friend of Ted Stevens. They considered themselves brothers, although they were on the opposite end of the political spectrum. But they cooperated a lot. Ted Stevens was the gentleman that my brother defeated for the U.S. Senate 7-8 years ago. What I can say about that is this is the bureaucracy, and they live from administration to administration. They live in 30 to 40-year career paths. When a new administration comes in and the dog and pony show isn't working, they just park the project in another country. For a while, like Star Wars, it was parked in Australia during the time that the very beginnings of the Clinton administration. By the end, he had called for the abandonment of the ABM treaty, and things had shifted the other direction. But what I would say is there is indeed a government as described, and they run on the secrecy syndrome, where they have classified more and more information that should not be classified. The concepts, the ideas we ought to be debating publicly. The mechanisms to how to build hardware perhaps is a matter of national security. But the concepts of what we do, the methods that we deploy, should we be kidnapping people? Should we be torturing them? Should we be using extortion and bribery? These are the things of our government today. And if we don't do it, we do it through surrogate governments that we manipulate and control. Well, people are worried about the Russians hacking the DNC. The fact of the matter is the United States government has hacked every single political party in the world that we look at as anything but our friend. And even our friends, if you recall, were being tapped. The heads of state for every one of our allies' phones were tapped and monitored by our government. If that isn't interference, I don't know what is. But this is not the nature of the American character, the people that populate this country. This is the nature of those who have taken the government from us. And it is that shadowy government. And it is that cluster of corporations that trade positions between government and corporations as they weave a tapestry that serves them and no longer serves us.
And then there's the other part of the government, right? There's the innocent and genuine American who says, I want to serve, and goes in and tries to serve. So we're dealing with, I think, two very different entities here. And,
it's a war at that level. It's a war at that level because there are people with integrity in government. They're just not as common anymore. And that's the sad story is, apathy has brought about a lot of changes. I say this often. Whatever you feel about Donald Trump, he was the bomb America needed to go off. People are paying attention to government again.
Yes.
And I don't care what it took to get us there. I'm just glad we are there again, and we have an opportunity to change this nation again and have an impact on the world that isn't about controlling everything that goes on in the world, but is an example that other people want to emulate. We've lost that, and we can reclaim that. Our birthright as human beings, which is where our founding fathers began, individual idea of created and being created and creating something good.
Yeah. Bernie Sanders just recently had said, get involved. And I think that is about the most useful, productive comment I have heard come out of politics in the longest time. That's exactly what needs to happen. You want to make a change, then, well, it just might be you. Get involved. That is how change happens, is by all of us getting involved. Nick, Doctor, I got to tell you, this has been fantastic tonight. I look forward to the next time that you can come on the program. And tell Alex Jones, I talk about him a lot on my show, and not in a good way at all. But we do agree on some things, but most of the time I talk about how much I don't like him. So tell him I said hello.